There are places where direction becomes unreliable. Quad Creek Meadows sits at 8,900 feet in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, accessible only by a 4-mile trail that branches off Forest Road 212. The meadow itself is unremarkable by Montana standards, roughly 3 acres of subalpine grass ringed by lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce. A seasonal creek cuts through the eastern edge, fed by snowmelt that persists into July. The Forest Service does not maintain the trail. No signs mark the turnoff. Most topographic maps label the area simply as open terrain, without specific designation. It has been known to backcountry guides for decades, though few recommend it. The meadow's reputation began with compass failures. Early reports are difficult to verify, but by the late 1970s, enough hikers had noted the phenomenon that a brief mention appeared in a regional outdoor magazine. The article described compasses spinning wildly or pointing in the wrong direction when used within the meadow's boundaries. The writer attributed it to localized magnetic rock formations, a common enough occurrence in mountainous terrain, but the explanation did not account for what happened in the summer of 1981. A geology graduate student named Brian Kowalski hiked into Quad Creek Meadows with 3 compasses and a handheld magnetometer. He was researching magnetic anomalies in the Beartooth Range and had heard secondhand accounts of unusual readings in the area. Kowalski set up a base camp on the meadow's western edge and began taking measurements at 30-minute intervals. What he recorded defied standard geophysical principles. Over the course of 17 minutes, magnetic north gradually shifted counterclockwise. The compass needle did not spin erratically. It moved smoothly, steadily, as if the poles themselves were rotating. At the end of the 17-minute period, the needle pointed directly south. Then, without transition, it snapped back to north. Kowalski repeated the test. The inversion occurred again, beginning exactly 6 hours after the first event. He documented 4 full cycles over a 48-hour period. Each lasted 17 minutes. Each occurred at precise 6-hour intervals. The magnetometer confirmed the readings. Kowalski's field notes, later reviewed by his academic advisor, described the phenomenon as mechanically regular and inconsistent with any known magnetic field behavior. His advisor suggested he had miscalibrated the instruments. Kowalski returned to the site 3 weeks later with different equipment. The results were identical. He submitted his findings to a geophysics journal. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that the data, if accurate, would require a localized reversal of planetary magnetic orientation, which they deemed physically impossible. Kowalski did not pursue the research further. He completed his degree and took a position with an energy company in Texas. In a brief email exchange in 2007, he confirmed the measurements but declined to discuss them in detail. He wrote only that the site had made him uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the instruments. The temporal distortions began appearing in reports a few years later. In 1986, 2 hikers from Bozeman, Jeffrey Millard and his partner Rachel Ortiz, spent a night camped in the meadow. They had planned a 3-day loop through the wilderness and estimated they would reach Quad Creek by mid-afternoon on the 2nd day. According to their journal, they arrived on a schedule, set up camp, and spent the evening near the creek. Millard noted the sunset occurred around 8:45, which matched the expected time for late August. When they returned to the trailhead the following afternoon, Millard's truck was gone. They assumed it had been stolen and hiked 2 miles to the nearest Forest Service station to report the theft. The ranger on duty checked the parking log and informed them that the truck had been towed 4 days earlier after sitting in the lot for over a week. Millard insisted they had been gone for only 3 days. The ranger showed them the calendar. It was September 3rd. They had left on August 26th. 8 days had passed. Millard and Ortiz had no memory of the missing time. Search and rescue records confirm that a missing persons report had been filed on August 30th. A team had been dispatched to search the trail to Quad Creek, but found no evidence of the hikers. The report noted that the campsite showed no signs of recent use and that the search was called off after 2 days. Millard and Ortiz were examined by a physician in Livingston. Both were dehydrated and mildly malnourished, consistent with having been in the wilderness for 8 days rather than 3. Neither showed signs of head trauma or disorientation beyond their insistence that only 3 days had elapsed. The incident was filed as a case of temporal confusion due to environmental stress. No further investigation was conducted. By the mid-1990s, at least 6 similar cases had been informally documented. A seasonal ranger named Patricia Delgado kept a personal file of reports from hikers who claimed time had moved strangely in the meadow. She described the accounts as remarkably consistent. Individuals would camp overnight, experience what felt like normal passage of time, and return to find that significantly more time had elapsed in the outside world. In one case, a solo hiker named Gordon Travers entered the meadow on a Friday afternoon and emerged Sunday evening, believing he had stayed for one night. His vehicle registration had expired during what he perceived as a single day. He later told Delgado that he remembered watching the sun set once and rise once, with nothing unusual about the duration of darkness. Delgado submitted her file to the district supervisor in 1998. The supervisor reviewed it and returned it to her with a note suggesting that the incidents were likely the result of disorientation or unreliable self-reporting. The file was not added to any official record. Delgado retired in 2004. In an interview conducted years later, she stated that she had stopped recommending Quad Creek to visitors, though she could not articulate exactly why. A physics professor from Montana State University, Dr. Harold Finch, visited the meadow in 2001 with portable atomic clocks and GPS receivers. He had read Kowalski's unpublished paper and wanted to verify the magnetic anomaly. He confirmed the 17-minute inversion cycle. He also noted that GPS signals within the meadow were unstable, displaying location errors of up to 50 meters despite clear sky conditions. But it was the atomic clocks that produced the most unsettling data. Finch synchronized 2 clocks before entering the meadow. He left one at the trailhead and carried the other into the site. After spending 12 hours in the meadow, he hiked back out and compared the clocks. The clock that remained at the trailhead showed the expected elapsed time. The clock that had been in the meadow was 17 minutes behind. Finch repeated the test on a second visit. The result was identical. He prepared a paper for submission to a peer-reviewed journal. The paper was declined. One reviewer wrote that environmental factors must have affected the instrument, though Finch had controlled for temperature, altitude, and electromagnetic interference. Another reviewer suggested that the findings, if accurate, would require a fundamental revision of relativistic physics at a localized scale, which they considered implausible. Finch did not return to the site. He has not published on the subject since. The Forest Service maintains no special designation for Quad Creek Meadows. It is not marked as a research area. It is not closed to public access. Requests for information about magnetic anomalies or temporal distortions in the region are typically redirected to generic wilderness safety guidelines. In 2013, a group of undergraduate students from the University of Montana attempted to camp in the meadow as part of an informal investigation inspired by Internet forums. They brought cameras, compasses, and GPS devices. They documented the magnetic inversion and recorded several hours of video. When they reviewed the footage later, they found that the timestamps were inconsistent. Segments that they remembered lasting 10 or 15 minutes appeared on the video as lasting over an hour. In one clip, the sky visibly darkened and lightened again in what the students recalled as a span of minutes, but which the camera recorded as a full night. One of the students, Ashley Brennan, described the experience in an online post. "It didn't feel wrong while we were there. It felt normal. It was only afterward, looking at the recordings, that we realized something had happened that we couldn't account for." The group did not return. The meadow is still accessible. The trail is still open. Hikers still camp there, though fewer than in previous decades. Some report nothing unusual. Others do not return on the day they planned. And every 6 hours, like a clock no one wound, the compasses still reverse. There are places where direction becomes unreliable. Quad Creek Meadows sits at 8,900 feet in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, accessible only by a 4-mile trail that branches off Forest Road 212. The meadow itself is unremarkable by Montana standards, roughly 3 acres of subalpine grass ringed by lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce. A seasonal creek cuts through the eastern edge, fed by snowmelt that persists into July. The Forest Service does not maintain the trail. No signs mark the turnoff. Most topographic maps label the area simply as open terrain, without specific designation. It has been known to backcountry guides for decades, though few recommend it. The meadow's reputation began with compass failures. Early reports are difficult to verify, but by the late 1970s, enough hikers had noted the phenomenon that a brief mention appeared in a regional outdoor magazine. The article described compasses spinning wildly or pointing in the wrong direction when used within the meadow's boundaries. The writer attributed it to localized magnetic rock formations, a common enough occurrence in mountainous terrain, but the explanation did not account for what happened in the summer of 1981. A geology graduate student named Brian Kowalski hiked into Quad Creek Meadows with 3 compasses and a handheld magnetometer. He was researching magnetic anomalies in the Beartooth Range and had heard secondhand accounts of unusual readings in the area. Kowalski set up a base camp on the meadow's western edge and began taking measurements at 30-minute intervals. What he recorded defied standard geophysical principles. Over the course of 17 minutes, magnetic north gradually shifted counterclockwise. The compass needle did not spin erratically. It moved smoothly, steadily, as if the poles themselves were rotating. At the end of the 17-minute period, the needle pointed directly south. Then, without transition, it snapped back to north. Kowalski repeated the test. The inversion occurred again, beginning exactly 6 hours after the first event. He documented 4 full cycles over a 48-hour period. Each lasted 17 minutes. Each occurred at precise 6-hour intervals. The magnetometer confirmed the readings. Kowalski's field notes, later reviewed by his academic advisor, described the phenomenon as mechanically regular and inconsistent with any known magnetic field behavior. His advisor suggested he had miscalibrated the instruments. Kowalski returned to the site 3 weeks later with different equipment. The results were identical. He submitted his findings to a geophysics journal. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted that the data, if accurate, would require a localized reversal of planetary magnetic orientation, which they deemed physically impossible. Kowalski did not pursue the research further. He completed his degree and took a position with an energy company in Texas. In a brief email exchange in 2007, he confirmed the measurements but declined to discuss them in detail. He wrote only that the site had made him uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the instruments. The temporal distortions began appearing in reports a few years later. In 1986, two hikers from Bozeman, Jeffrey Millard and his partner Rachel Ortiz, spent a night camped in the meadow. They had planned a 3-day loop through the wilderness and estimated they would reach Quad Creek by mid-afternoon on the second day. According to their journal, they arrived on a schedule, set up camp, and spent the evening near the creek. Millard noted the sunset occurred around 8:45, which matched the expected time for late August. When they returned to the trailhead the following afternoon, Millard's truck was gone. They assumed it had been stolen and hiked 2 miles to the nearest Forest Service station to report the theft. The ranger on duty checked the parking log and informed them that the truck had been towed 4 days earlier after sitting in the lot for over a week. Millard insisted they had been gone for only 3 days. The ranger showed them the calendar. It was September 3rd. They had left on August 26th. 8 days had passed. Millard and Ortiz had no memory of the missing time. Search and rescue records confirm that a missing persons report had been filed on August 30th. A team had been dispatched to search the trail to Quad Creek, but found no evidence of the hikers. The report noted that the campsite showed no signs of recent use and that the search was called off after 2 days. Millard and Ortiz were examined by a physician in Livingston. Both were dehydrated and mildly malnourished, consistent with having been in the wilderness for 8 days rather than 3. Neither showed signs of head trauma or disorientation beyond their insistence that only 3 days had elapsed. The incident was filed as a case of temporal confusion due to environmental stress. No further investigation was conducted. By the mid-1990s, at least 6 similar cases had been informally documented. A seasonal ranger named Patricia Delgado kept a personal file of reports from hikers who claimed time had moved strangely in the meadow. She described the accounts as remarkably consistent. Individuals would camp overnight, experience what felt like normal passage of time, and return to find that significantly more time had elapsed in the outside world. In one case, a solo hiker named Gordon Travers entered the meadow on a Friday afternoon and emerged Sunday evening, believing he had stayed for 1 night. His vehicle registration had expired during what he perceived as a single day. He later told Delgado that he remembered watching the sun set once and rise once, with nothing unusual about the duration of darkness. Delgado submitted her file to the district supervisor in 1998. The supervisor reviewed it and returned it to her with a note suggesting that the incidents were likely the result of disorientation or unreliable self-reporting. The file was not added to any official record. Delgado retired in 2004. In an interview conducted years later, she stated that she had stopped recommending Quad Creek to visitors, though she could not articulate exactly why. A physics professor from Montana State University, Dr. Harold Finch, visited the meadow in 2001 with portable atomic clocks and GPS receivers. He had read Kowalski's unpublished paper and wanted to verify the magnetic anomaly. He confirmed the 17-minute inversion cycle. He also noted that GPS signals within the meadow were unstable, displaying location errors of up to 50 meters despite clear sky conditions. But it was the atomic clocks that produced the most unsettling data. Finch synchronized 2 clocks before entering the meadow. He left one at the trailhead and carried the other into the site. After spending 12 hours in the meadow, he hiked back out and compared the clocks. The clock that remained at the trailhead showed the expected elapsed time. The clock that had been in the meadow was 17 minutes behind. Finch repeated the test on a second visit. The result was identical. He prepared a paper for submission to a peer-reviewed journal. The paper was declined. One reviewer wrote that environmental factors must have affected the instrument, though Finch had controlled for temperature, altitude, and electromagnetic interference. Another reviewer suggested that the findings, if accurate, would require a fundamental revision of relativistic physics at a localized scale, which they considered implausible. Finch did not return to the site. He has not published on the subject since. The Forest Service maintains no special designation for Quad Creek Meadows. It is not marked as a research area. It is not closed to public access. Requests for information about magnetic anomalies or temporal distortions in the region are typically redirected to generic wilderness safety guidelines. In 2013, a group of undergraduate students from the University of Montana attempted to camp in the meadow as part of an informal investigation inspired by Internet forums. They brought cameras, compasses, and GPS devices. They documented the magnetic inversion and recorded several hours of video. When they reviewed the footage later, they found that the timestamps were inconsistent. Segments that they remembered lasting 10 or 15 minutes appeared on the video as lasting over an hour. In one clip, the sky visibly darkened and lightened again in what the students recalled as a span of minutes, but which the camera recorded as a full night. One of the students, Ashley Brennan, described the experience in an online post. "It didn't feel wrong while we were there. It felt normal. It was only afterward, looking at the recordings, that we realized something had happened that we couldn't account for." The group did not return. The meadow is still accessible. The trail is still open. Hikers still camp there, though fewer than in previous decades. Some report nothing unusual. Others do not return on the day they planned. And every 6 hours, like a clock no one wound, the compasses still reverse. Some monuments refuse to stay where they were planted. The Rock Creek Vista Point area of the Beartooth Highway has been surveyed more times than almost any comparable stretch of mountain road in the continental United States. The route itself was constructed between 1932 and 1936, carved into Precambrian rock that dates back nearly 3 billion years. The roadway engineers documented every elevation change, every geological feature, every potential hazard. When the United States Geological Survey returned in the late 1970s to establish a network of permanent reference markers, they chose locations known for their stability. Granite does not move. Bedrock does not shift without seismic activity. Survey markers, once anchored, are designed to remain fixed for centuries. But along this particular 5-mile section, something else was happening. The USGS project began in June of 1977. A 4-person team led by surveyor Donald Casper placed 12 bronze markers at quarter-mile intervals between mile markers 51 and 56. Each marker was a standard design, a 3.5-inch bronze disc stamped with identification codes and elevation data, set into a concrete anchor drilled 18 inches into solid rock. The team used theodolites and early electronic distance measurement equipment to record precise coordinates for each installation. Casper's field notes described the work as routine. The weather was clear. The rock was stable. Every marker was installed according to federal specifications. The team completed the project in 11 days and submitted their findings to the regional USGS office in Denver. The coordinates were entered into the National Geodetic Survey database, where they would serve as permanent reference points for future mapping and construction projects. 5 years later, a highway maintenance crew reported that one of the markers was missing. The crew had been contracted to assess erosion along the shoulder near mile marker 53. Their supervisor, a man named Eugene Walters, noticed that the survey disc was no longer where the maintenance maps indicated it should be. Walters assumed vandalism or equipment theft and filed a report with the Forest Service. But when a USGS technician was dispatched to verify the loss, she found the marker still present, 42 feet south of its documented position. The marker was still anchored in granite. The concrete base showed no signs of disturbance. The rock around it was undisturbed by tool marks or drilling. It simply was not where it had been placed. The technician, Gloria Ishikawa, resurveyed the area and confirmed the discrepancy. She also discovered that two other markers along the same stretch had moved. One had migrated 31 feet to the west. Another had shifted 19 feet upslope, now sitting at an elevation 7 feet higher than originally recorded. Ishikawa documented her findings and requested an investigation. Her report included photographs comparing the current positions to the original survey diagrams. The photographs were clear. The markers had moved. Her supervisor in Denver reviewed the report and responded with a memo stating that the original coordinates must have been recorded incorrectly. Ishikawa countered that Casper's team had been experienced professionals using calibrated equipment and that the likelihood of simultaneous errors across multiple markers was statistically implausible. She recommended a full resurvey of the entire 12-marker network. The request was denied. Ishikawa was reassigned to a project in Nevada 3 months later. She did not protest the transfer. Donald Casper, the original surveyor, was tracked down by a journalist in 1994. By then retired and living in Boise, Casper reviewed copies of Ishikawa's photographs and confirmed that the markers were not where his team had placed them. He also revealed something he had not included in his original report. During the installation in 1977, the team had experienced unusual equipment malfunctions. The electronic distance measurement devices had periodically displayed readings that fluctuated by several meters despite being aimed at fixed targets. Casper had attributed the errors to atmospheric conditions or instrument calibration drift. But on the final day of the project, one of his team members, a junior surveyor named Helen Briggs, had mentioned that her compass was acting strange near marker number 8. Casper had dismissed it at the time. Compasses were known to behave erratically near certain rock formations rich in magnetite. He had not considered it worth documenting. But when shown the photographs of the moved markers, Casper noted that all three were located within a half-mile radius of marker number 8. Helen Briggs could not be located for comment. Employment records show she left the USGS in 1979 and moved to British Columbia. Attempts to reach her through known addresses were unsuccessful. In 1996, a graduate student in geophysics named Marcus Aldridge obtained permission to study the site as part of his thesis on crustal stability in mountainous regions. He brought ground-penetrating radar and differential GPS equipment. His goal was to determine whether subsurface geological activity could account for the marker displacements. The ground-penetrating radar showed no voids, faults, or anomalies beneath the markers. The granite was solid and continuous to a depth of over 20 meters. Differential GPS readings matched the positions Ishikawa had documented in 1982, confirming that the markers had not moved further in the intervening 14 years. But Aldridge also discovered something else. When he compared his GPS data to the original USGS database entries from 1977, he found that the coordinates in the database did not match Casper's handwritten field notes. The database had been updated at some point to reflect the current marker positions, making it appear as though they had always been there. Aldridge requested access to the original paper records. He was told they had been digitized and the physical files archived. When he asked where the archives were stored, he was informed that the specific documents were not available for public review. His thesis advisor suggested he focus on a different case study. Aldridge changed the topic of his thesis. He graduated in 1998 and took a position with an oil exploration company in Alberta. He has not returned to the subject. The markers themselves remain in place. A hiker who visits the Rock Creek Vista Point area can still find several of them, now weathered by decades of exposure, but locating them requires ignoring the coordinates listed in current databases and instead using the older pre-1982 maps, or simply walking the area until the bronze discs appear underfoot. In 2003, the entire data set related to the Beartooth Highway survey markers was classified under a designation that restricts access to authorized personnel. The change was not announced publicly. Researchers attempting to reference the data for academic or commercial projects have been told that the information is no longer available for distribution due to national security considerations. No explanation has been provided as to why survey markers on a public highway would fall under such restrictions. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2009 returned a heavily redacted response. The few legible portions confirmed that the markers had been reevaluated in the early 2000s, but the nature of the evaluation and its conclusions were entirely blacked out. A follow-up request was denied. Former Forest Service employee Thomas Ridgway, who worked in the area during the 1980s and 90s, mentioned the markers in a local history interview conducted in 2015. He recalled that rangers had been told not to discuss them with visitors. He did not know why. He also noted that on at least 2 occasions, USGS personnel had arrived unannounced to inspect the markers, staying for several hours and leaving without filing any public reports. Ridgway described the instructions as odd, but not unusual for that part of the highway. When asked what he meant, he said only that there were other things up there that didn't make sense either. The journalist conducting the interview did not follow up. In 2017, a wilderness guide named Simone Ibarra took a group of photographers to the Rock Creek area. One of the photographers, attempting to use a survey marker as a stable platform for a tripod, noticed that the marker seemed loose. When he examined it more closely, he found that the concrete anchor had developed a series of fine cracks radiating outward from the piece. The cracks were fresh. The edges were sharp, not yet weathered. Ibarra reported the damage to the Forest Service, assuming it was the result of freeze-thaw cycles. A maintenance crew was dispatched. They documented the cracks, removed the marker, and filled the hole with fresh concrete. The marker was not replaced. No explanation was given. The 11 remaining markers are still there. 3 of them are not where they were originally placed. The records that might explain how they moved are locked away. And somewhere in the Federal Archives, a set of field notes describes a compass that would not point north. Some buildings are constructed over something that was never supposed to be found. Island Lake sits at 9,200 feet along the Beartooth Highway corridor, surrounded by peaks that hold snow well into August. The lake itself is glacial in origin, carved out during the last ice age and fed by runoff from the Beartooth Plateau. The area was largely uninhabited until the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps began constructing the highway and its associated infrastructure. One of those structures was a small ranger station built on the lake's southwestern shore in 1936. The station was utilitarian, single-story wood frame construction on a poured concrete foundation. It served as a seasonal outpost for Forest Service personnel, monitoring trail conditions and providing assistance to travelers. The building was never staffed year-round. Heavy snow made access impossible from October through May. But for 72 summers, rangers lived and worked there, keeping logs, maintaining equipment, and responding to emergencies in the high country. The station was slated for demolition in 2007. The structure had deteriorated beyond repair, and the Forest Service decided it was more cost-effective to remove it than to renovate. A contractor from Billings, a firm called Mountain States Construction, was awarded the project. Work began in June of 2008. The crew supervisor, A man named Victor Harlan expected a straightforward job. The building was small and the foundation was shallow. Demolition was projected to take less than a week. They found the second foundation on the third day. The original 1936 foundation had been poured in the standard fashion, a rectangular slab of concrete, 18 inches thick, with anchor bolts set to secure the wooden frame. But when the crew began breaking up the concrete to remove it, they discovered that beneath it, separated by only a thin layer of compacted soil, was another foundation. This one was older, much older. The second foundation was stone rather than concrete. It consisted of hand-cut granite blocks, fitted together with mortar that had hardened to a consistency nearly indistinguishable from the stone itself. The dimensions matched the upper foundation almost exactly. The blocks were weathered, their surfaces pitted by exposure, though they had been buried for decades. Harlan halted work and contacted the Forest Service. A regional archaeologist, Dr. Lillian Espinoza, was dispatched to the site. She arrived 2 days later and spent an afternoon examining the stonework. Her preliminary assessment was that the foundation dated to the late 19th century, though she noted that no records indicated any structure had been built at Island Lake prior to 1936. The area had been surveyed multiple times by government expeditions and mining prospectors. None had reported evidence of previous construction. Espinoza took samples of the mortar for laboratory analysis. The results came back 3 weeks later. Carbon dating placed the mortar's creation between 1888 and 1894. There was no explanation for how a stone foundation from the 1890s could exist beneath a Forest Service station built in 1936, in a location that had been documented as undeveloped wilderness. The demolition crew resumed work with instructions to carefully document the lower foundation. As they removed the soil and debris between the two layers, they began finding objects. The first was a set of hand tools, a chisel, a hammer, and a mason's trowel. The tools were heavily corroded but intact. They appeared to be of late 19th century manufacture, consistent with the dating of the stonework. Then they found the personal items. Buried in the soil layer between the two foundations were several objects that should not have been there: a leather-bound journal too degraded to open, a tin cup with a maker's mark that predated 1900, and a pocket watch. The watch was still running. Harlan described it as a standard railroad-style pocket watch, gold-plated, with Roman numerals on the face. The back was engraved with initials, TMR. The watch had been sealed in a small wooden box, which had protected it from moisture. When Harlan opened the box, the watch was ticking. It displayed a time that was 3 hours and 47 minutes ahead of local mountain time. Harlan reset the watch to match his own and continued working. By the end of the day, the watch had drifted again, this time showing a time 2 hours and 11 minutes behind. He assumed the mechanism was damaged and set the watch aside. Dr. Espinoza returned to examine the objects. She arranged for the watch to be sent to a horologist in Missoula for evaluation. The horologist, Martin Vasquez, reported that the watch was in full working order. The movement was consistent with watches manufactured in the 1880s. There was no evidence of modern repair or replacement parts, but the time zone it was set to did not correspond to any standard or historical time zone used in Montana. Vasquez noted that the watch appeared to be calibrated to a longitudinal position roughly 38 degrees west of its actual location. He could not explain why it would have been set that way or how it had remained functional after more than a century of burial. The journal was sent to a conservation lab for analysis. Technicians were able to separate some of the pages and photograph the contents under controlled lighting. The writing was faint but legible in places. The entries were dated between July and October of 1891. The author was never identified. The handwriting was formal. The language was precise, and the entries described work on a structure at elevation intended to serve as a waypoint for those traveling the high road. The entries made reference to survey marks already in place and coordinates verified by instrument. No high road existed in 1891. The Beartooth Highway would not be conceived for another 40 years. The Forest Service commissioned a full archaeological survey of the site. A team from the University of Montana spent 2 weeks excavating the area around the foundations. They confirmed that the lower foundation was structurally complete and had once supported a building. The building's footprint matched the ranger station almost exactly. They also found remnants of what appeared to be interior walls and a stone hearth, all dating to the same period as the foundation. The hearth contained charcoal that carbon dated to 1892. The survey report concluded that a structure had been built at Island Lake in the early 1890s and subsequently demolished or abandoned, leaving only the foundation. Decades later, the Forest Service had unknowingly built their ranger station on top of it. But the report did not address several troubling details. The stone foundation was built to a level of precision uncommon for frontier construction. The blocks were cut to tolerances typically associated with institutional or government projects, not private homesteads or prospector shelters. The dimensions were exact. The layout suggested knowledge of architectural principles that would have been unusual in such a remote location, and no historical record acknowledged the existence of the original structure. Espinosa submitted a request to access territorial-era land surveys and government expedition logs. She was told that the relevant documents were held in federal archives and would require a formal records request. She filed the request in 2009. The request was denied. The reason given was that the documents in question were part of a sensitive collection related to early topographic surveys and were not available for public or academic view. Espinosa appealed the decision. The appeal was denied. She attempted to publish her findings in an archaeology journal. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the conclusions were insufficiently supported and suggested that the lower foundation might have been a natural rock formation misidentified as human construction. Espinosa withdrew the paper. She left the University of Montana in 2011 and now works for a private cultural resource management firm in Oregon. She has not returned to the subject. The demolition of the ranger station was completed in late summer of 2008. Both foundations were removed. The site was leveled and reseeded with native grasses. The Forest Service installed a small informational sign near the trailhead, noting that a ranger station had once stood there, but making no mention of the earlier structure. The objects recovered from the site were cataloged and stored in a Forest Service warehouse in Missoula. Researcher attempting to view them in 2014 was told they had been transferred to another facility for further study. The facility was not named. The pocket watch was never returned to the warehouse. Its current location is unknown. And in the soil beneath where the foundations once stood, there are still objects that were never excavated, things left behind by whoever built the first structure in a place that wasn't supposed to exist, on a road that hadn't been imagined yet. There is an elevation where the air carries voices that should no longer exist. The Beartooth Highway climbs through some of the highest drivable terrain in the northern Rockies, reaching its peak at 10,947 feet above sea level. The road was an engineering marvel when it opened in 1936, blasted through granite and stretched across plateaus where the tree line gives way to alpine tundra. Weather stations along the route measure temperature, wind speed, and barometric pressure. Communications infrastructure is sparse. Cell service is non-existent for most of the corridor. Travelers rely on CB radios or vehicle-mounted FM receivers for emergency contact and weather updates. But at one specific elevation, radios stop receiving the station's drivers expect. The phenomenon occurs in a narrow band roughly 2 miles long, beginning just east of Beartooth Lake and extending toward the highway's summit. The elevation is consistent, 10,947 feet, give or take 6 feet, depending on the precision of the altimeter. Within this zone, vehicle radios, regardless of make, model, or year, retune themselves to a frequency between 118.2 and 118.6 megahertz. That range is reserved for aviation communication, specifically air traffic control. But there is no airport within 60 miles. There is no control tower. There are no scheduled flights over the Beartooth Plateau. And yet, the radios broadcast voices. The first documented report came from a truck driver named Randall Oakes in the summer of 1979. Oakes was hauling freight from Billings to Cody and had stopped to check his load near Beartooth Lake. His CB radio, normally tuned to Channel 19 for highway communication, suddenly began picking up what he described as official-sounding chatter that resembled airport tower instructions. Oakes pulled over and listened. The transmissions were clipped, professional, and used terminology he recognized from his time in the Air Force during the Korean War. Call signs, altitude instructions, bearing corrections. But the call signs were unfamiliar, and the voices never acknowledged his attempts to respond. He recorded 3 minutes of audio on a cassette tape before the signal faded. When he descended below 10,000 feet, his radio returned to normal. Oakes submitted the tape to the Federal Aviation Administration office in Billings, along with a written account of the incident. He received a form letter 6 weeks later thanking him for his report and informing him that no irregularities had been detected in the region's airspace. The tape was not returned. By the mid-1980s, other drivers had begun reporting similar experiences. A survey conducted by a regional trucking association in 1986 found that roughly 1 in 12 drivers who regularly traveled the Beartooth Highway had encountered the phenomenon at least once. Most described it as brief, lasting between 2 and 8 minutes, and occurring only within a specific stretch of road. The transmissions were always the same type, air traffic control instructions delivered in calm, methodical tones. The voices were male, though some drivers reported hearing a female voice on occasion. The instructions referred to aircraft using call signs that followed military formatting, 2 letters followed by 3 or 4 numbers. A retired air traffic controller named Janice Pruitt heard one of the recordings in 1988. She had worked at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls during the 1960s and was familiar with military communication protocols. After listening to a tape recorded by a motorist near the summit, she noted that the call signs matched a format used by Strategic Air Command during the Cold War. But the specific call signs on the tape did not correspond to any aircraft she could identify in declassified records. Pruitt contacted the FAA and requested information about transmitters operating in the 118 megahertz range near the Beartooth Highway. She was told that no such transmitters existed. Aviation frequencies in that band were used exclusively for line-of-sight communication between aircraft and control towers, and the nearest active tower was in Billings, far beyond range of the highway. She asked if historical military transmitters might still be operational. The FAA referred her to the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense did not respond to her inquiry. In 1993, an electronics engineer named David Kosar drove the Beartooth Highway with a spectrum analyzer and a digital recorder. Kosar had heard about the phenomenon through a ham radio forum and wanted to determine whether the transmissions were real or the result of atmospheric conditions causing distant signals to propagate unusually. At 10,947 feet, his equipment detected a strong, continuous signal on 118.4 megahertz. The signal lasted 11 minutes as he drove through the zone. He recorded the audio and later analyzed it using software designed to identify modulation patterns. The transmissions were AM, amplitude modulation, consistent with older aviation communication systems. The audio quality was unusually clean, with none of the static or distortion typical of long-range propagation. COSAR noted that the signal strength suggested a transmitter within 5 miles, though no such transmitter appeared on any FAA or FCC database. He also identified something else. Embedded in the audio were brief sequences of what sounded like coded language, strings of numbers, and phonetic alphabet letters that did not correspond to standard aviation terminology. COSAR ran the sequences through several decryption methods, including known military codes from the Cold War era. 2 of the sequences matched a cipher system used by Strategic Air Command for nuclear bomber communication during the early 1960s. COSAR submitted his findings to an aviation safety journal. The paper was declined. The editor suggested that the recordings might be hoaxes or that COSAR had misidentified the source of the transmissions. COSAR sent copies of the recordings to the National Security Agency under the Freedom of Information Act, requesting information about whether the cipher system was still in use. The NSA responded that it could neither confirm nor deny the existence of records related to his inquiry. In 2001, a journalist named Angela Ferris drove the highway while researching a feature on mountain communication anomalies. She brought a handheld aviation radio and tuned it to 118.4 megahertz as she climbed toward the summit. At the specified elevation, the radio activated. The transmission was identical in structure to those described in earlier reports. Calm, authoritative voices issuing altitude and heading corrections. Ferris recorded 14 minutes of audio. When she returned to her office in Missoula, she hired a linguistic analyst to examine the recordings. The analyst, Dr. Raymond Kapoor, noted that the speech patterns and vocabulary were consistent with military communication from the 1960s. He also identified several phrases that used terminology no longer in active use by modern air traffic controllers. One phrase in particular stood out: "Confirm status on Echo Tango 7 at Rally Point Xerxes." Dr. Kapoor found no reference to Rally Point Xerxes in any declassified military document. He suggested it might be a code name for a geographic location, but he could not identify which one. Ferris contacted the FAA, the Department of Defense, and the National Transportation Safety Board. None provided substantive responses. The FAA reiterated that no transmitters operated in the area. The Department of Defense declined to comment. The NTSB stated that the matter fell outside their jurisdiction. Ferris's article was published in a regional magazine in 2002. It included transcripts of the recordings and interviews with drivers who had experienced the phenomenon. The article attracted brief attention, but no official follow-up. 6 months later, Ferris received a phone call from an individual who identified himself as a former Air Force communications officer. He did not provide his name. He told her that during his service in the 1960s, he had worked at a facility in Montana that coordinated communication with high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The facility, he said, had been decommissioned in 1968. Its exact location was classified, but he confirmed that the call signs and terminology in her recordings matched systems he had used during his service. He also told her that the transmitters at the facility had been dismantled and removed when the base closed. Ferris asked how transmissions could still be occurring if the equipment no longer existed. The man did not answer. He ended the call and did not contact her again. In 2012, the FAA updated its frequency allocation maps for the region. The 118 MHz band remained designated for aviation use, but a note was added to the digital database indicating that localized atmospheric conditions may cause anomalous signal propagation near the Beartooth Highway summit. The note did not specify what those conditions were or why they only affected a narrow elevation band. Travelers still report the phenomenon. Online forums contain dozens of accounts from the past decade. Some drivers record the transmissions on their phones. The audio is remarkably consistent. Calm voices, military call signs, instructions that imply coordination of aircraft that are never seen. And in the recordings, there are still phrases in code, strings of letters and numbers that were never meant to be heard outside secure channels. No one has explained where they come from. No one has explained why they only occur at 10,947 feet. And somewhere in an archive, sealed and classified, there may be records of a facility that no longer exists, transmitting on a frequency that should be silent. Some places remember weather that hasn't happened yet. Clay Butte rises to 9,600 feet on the northeastern edge of the Beartooth Plateau, crowned by a fire lookout tower built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1942. The tower offers 360-degree views of the surrounding wilderness, glacial cirques to the west, the Clark's Fork Valley to the east and to the south, a broad expanse of alpine terrain studded with permanent snowfields that survive even the warmest summers. These snowfields are remnants of the Little Ice Age, small glaciers that have persisted in shaded bowls where winter accumulation exceeds summer melt. One of these snowfields has been photographed more than any other feature visible from the tower. It sits in a north-facing cirque approximately 2 miles southwest of Clay Butte, unnamed on most maps but referred to locally as the Hanging Field due to its position on a steep slope beneath a granite headwall. The snowfield covers roughly 8 acres and feeds a seasonal stream that flows into the Stillwater River drainage. It is monitored by the United States Geological Survey as part of a long-term study on alpine ice persistence, but the data collected from the Hanging Field has never been published. The anomaly was first noted in 1978 by a seasonal ranger named Theodore Bassett, who staffed the Clay Butte Tower during the summer fire season. Bassett was an amateur photographer and kept a log of landscape changes throughout the season. In early September, he photographed the Hanging Field and noted that it showed extensive avalanche debris and melt patterns typical of late spring. He found this unusual because the summer had been relatively cool and most snowfields in the region were stable. When he compared his photographs to those he had taken in June, he realized the snowfield had changed in ways that seemed backward. The September image showed less snow coverage than the June image, but the melt patterns suggested the September conditions should have occurred weeks earlier. Bassett mentioned the observation in his end-of-season report. The Forest Service filed it without comment. The following year, Bassett returned to the tower and began systematically photographing the Hanging Field at 2-week intervals. By the end of the summer, he had documented a pattern that defied explanation. The snowfield's seasonal progression consistently lagged behind the actual calendar by approximately 4 weeks. In early July, when surrounding snowfields showed typical midsummer conditions, the Hanging Field appeared to still be in late spring melt. In August, when most high country snow had reached its minimum extent, the Hanging Field was just beginning to show the melt patterns other fields had displayed in June. Bassett compiled his photographs into a presentation and submitted it to the Regional Forest Service office in Cody. A hydrologist reviewed the materials and suggested that the snowfield's orientation and shading might account for delayed melting. Bassett countered that other north-facing snowfields in similar positions did not show the same lag. The hydrologist did not respond further. In 1982, a glaciologist from the University of Wyoming, Dr. Miriam Caldwell, visited Clay Butte to investigate the snowfield after hearing about Bassett's observations. Caldwell brought surveying equipment and spent 3 days taking measurements and photographs. She compared the snowfield's current state to historical aerial photographs dating back to the 1950s. The temporal lag appeared in every comparison. Photographs taken in March consistently showed conditions that matched what other snowfields experienced in late January. October images showed fresh snow accumulation that elsewhere didn't appear until late November. Caldwell calculated the offset at between 22 and 37 days, depending on the season. The lag was most pronounced during transitional periods, early spring and late fall, when weather patterns were changing rapidly. She could find no geological or meteorological reason for the delay. Caldwell installed a series of temperature and precipitation sensors around the snowfield in the summer of 1983. The sensors recorded data for 14 months before their batteries died. When Caldwell retrieved the data, she found that temperature and precipitation at the hanging field matched readings from other nearby monitoring stations. There was no microclimate effect. The weather was the same. But the snow behaved as if it were experiencing that weather several weeks later than it actually occurred. Caldwell submitted her findings to a glaciology journal in 1985. The paper was peer-reviewed, and 2 reviewers requested additional data, particularly regarding potential measurement errors or instrument malfunctions. Caldwell returned to the site the following summer to reinstall the sensors and extend the monitoring period. The new data confirmed the original pattern. The temporal offset remained consistent. The journal accepted the paper for publication, but before it went to press, Caldwell received a request from the USGS asking her to delay publication until they could conduct their own assessment of the site. Caldwell agreed and withdrew the paper temporarily. The USGS assessment was conducted in 1987 by a team of 3 scientists. They spent a week at the site taking measurements, photographing the snowfield from multiple angles, and reviewing Caldwell's data. Their preliminary report, submitted to the USGS regional office in Denver, acknowledged the temporal lag and described it as an unexplained anomaly requiring further investigation. The final report was never released. Caldwell requested a copy in 1989. She was told the report had been classified as internal review and was not available for public or academic access. She asked why. The response stated only that the findings had implications for ongoing research into climate patterns and that public release would be premature. Caldwell resubmitted her original paper to the journal. It was rejected. The editor noted that without the USGS report to corroborate her findings, the paper's conclusions could not be adequately supported. Caldwell retired from the University of Wyoming in 2003. In a recorded interview conducted years later, she stated that the hanging field remained the most puzzling sight I ever studied, and that she had never received a satisfactory explanation for why the government was interested in keeping it quiet. In the years since, other observers have noted the phenomenon. A wilderness guide named Samuel Kirby, who leads hiking trips in the Beartooth Mountains, began photographing the snowfield in 2007 after a client mentioned that it looked wrong for the time of year. Kirby compared his images to those posted online by other photographers who had visited Clay Butte on different dates. The temporal lag was still present. Kirby documented cases where the snowfield showed heavy spring runoff in late February, weeks before regional temperatures had risen above freezing, and instances where fresh snow cover appeared in early December, even though the last significant snowfall had occurred in mid-October. The new snow was not present on any surrounding terrain, only on the hanging field itself. Kirby sent his findings to the National Weather Service and the USGS. Neither agency responded. In 2015, a graduate student in atmospheric sciences named Lauren Ostergaard obtained permission to install remote cameras at Clay Butte as part of a study on snowfield dynamics. She positioned 3 cameras with views of the hanging field and programmed them to capture images every 6 hours. The cameras operated for 2 years. When Ostergaard reviewed the footage, she found that the temporal lag was not constant. During some periods, the snowfield's conditions matched the season. During others, the lag extended to nearly 6 weeks. She also noticed something else. On several occasions, the snowfield appeared to show conditions that had not yet occurred anywhere in the region. In one sequence from late March 2016, the hanging field displayed melt patterns typical of mid-April, but those patterns did not appear on surrounding snowfields until 3 weeks later, exactly as the hanging field had shown them. Ostergaard described it as though the snowfield were previewing the future state of the snow. She included this observation in her thesis, but noted that it was speculative and not supported by sufficient data. Her thesis advisor suggested she remove the section. Ostergaard revised the thesis and omitted the finding. She graduated in 2017 and now works for a private weather forecasting company. She has not pursued further research on the hanging field. The snowfield is still there. It still melts. It still accumulates. Photographers still visit Clay Butte and take pictures of the surrounding landscape. And in those pictures, the hanging field continues to show weather from a time that does not align with when the photograph was taken. The Forest Service has no official position on the phenomenon. The USGS has not released any updated studies. Requests for information are redirected to general inquiries about alpine snowfields, with no specific acknowledgement of the temporal lag. But in the archives of the USGS Denver office, there is a file labeled Clay Butte Anomaly, Ongoing Observation. The file has been flagged for restricted access since 1988. No one outside the agency has seen what it contains. And every winter, the hanging field receives snow that will not match the season in which it falls. There are places where memory becomes selective in ways no one can explain. The top of the World Store sits at 9,300 feet on the Wyoming side of the Beartooth Highway, though most visitors associate it with Montana due to its proximity to the state line. Built in 1964 as a seasonal gas station and general store, it serves as one of the few services along the 68-mile route. The building is modest, wood-frame construction, a single room with a counter, shelves stocked with basic supplies, and a small parking area overlooking the Clarks Fork Valley. The store operates only during summer months, typically from late May through early September when the highway is passable. The surrounding landscape is stark. Alpine meadows give way to patches of Krumholtz, stunted, wind-twisted trees that mark the upper limit of forest growth. The air is thin. Weather changes rapidly. Visitors often stop to acclimate, to photograph the view, or simply to rest before continuing their drive across the pass. It is during these stops that the phenomenon occurs. The pattern was first documented in 1981 by a psychologist named Dr. Ellen Varga, who was traveling through the area with her husband and 2 colleagues. They stopped at the top of the World Store in the early morning to purchase coffee and stretch their legs. The group spent approximately 15 minutes at the site before continuing west toward Red Lodge. 25 minutes later, while driving through a series of switchbacks, Varga realized she could not recall her husband's name. She remembered his face. She remembered their conversation that morning. She remembered that they had been married for 8 years. But when she tried to say his name aloud, nothing came. The word was simply absent from her mind. She asked him directly. He told her his name, Michael, and she recognized it immediately as though the information had been temporarily misplaced rather than erased. But the experience disturbed her enough that she made a note of it in the journal she kept during the trip. Later that evening, while reviewing the day's events, Varga discovered that one of her colleagues had experienced the same thing. He had been unable to recall the name of the other colleague for roughly 30 minutes after leaving the rest stop. Like Varga, he had retained all other memories of the person, their professional relationship, their shared projects, even specific conversations, but the name had been inaccessible. Varga began asking others who had traveled the highway whether they had noticed anything similar. Over the next 2 years, she collected informal reports from 16 individuals who described identical experiences. A temporary inability to recall names of companions, lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to several hours, occurring shortly after leaving the top-of-the-world area. In 1983, Varga published a brief paper in a regional psychology journal describing the phenomenon as a possible case of environmentally triggered transient anomia, a temporary loss of word retrieval specific to proper names. She suggested that altitude, atmospheric pressure, or localized electromagnetic conditions might be contributing factors. The paper attracted little attention. One reviewer suggested that the reports were anecdotal and could be attributed to normal memory lapses exacerbated by high-altitude stress. Varga did not pursue further research. She retired from academia in 1990 and moved to Oregon, but the reports continued. A truck driver named Kenneth Hartley logged the phenomenon in a CB radio forum in 1987. Hartley had been traveling with a trainee and stopped at the Top of the World store to refuel. Approximately 30 minutes after leaving, he realized he could not remember the trainee's name, despite having worked with him for 3 days. The effect lasted for 2 hours. Hartley described it as like having a blank spot in my head where the name should be. Several other drivers responded to Hartley's post, confirming similar experiences. One noted that the effect seemed stronger in the early morning before 7 a.m. Another mentioned that he had stopped at the site multiple times over the years and had only experienced the phenomenon twice, both times during summer months. In 1992, a neurologist named Dr. Philip Rousseau read about the phenomenon in a trucking magazine and decided to investigate. Rousseau specialized in memory disorders and was intrigued by the specificity of the effect. Names were forgotten, but other contextual information remained intact. He traveled to the Beartooth Highway with a research assistant in July of 1993. They stopped at the Top of the World store at 6:30 in the morning and remained for 20 minutes taking photographs and recording environmental data, temperature, barometric pressure, and electromagnetic field readings. All measurements were within normal ranges for the elevation. They left the site and continued driving. 35 minutes later, Rousseau realized he could not recall his assistant's name. He asked her to write it down. She did, Jennifer Caldwell. The name was immediately familiar, but it had been completely absent from his memory moments before. Rousseau's assistant had not experienced the effect. Rousseau himself regained full recall after approximately 90 minutes. He returned to the site 3 more times over the next 2 years, bringing different colleagues and visiting at various times of day. The phenomenon occurred on 2 of the 3 subsequent visits, affecting 3 out of 7 participants. In both cases, the effect manifested within 40 minutes of leaving and lasted between 1 and 4 hours. Rousseau documented the findings and submitted a paper to a neurology journal in 1995. The paper detailed the temporal pattern of the memory loss, the selective nature of the deficit, and the consistent geographic trigger. He proposed that an unknown environmental factor at the site was interfering with neural pathways associated with proper name retrieval. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the sample size was too small and that the study lacked controlled conditions. One reviewer noted that the effect could be explained by altitude-related cognitive impairment and did not warrant further investigation. Rousseau attempted to secure funding for a larger study. His applications were declined. He shifted his research focus to more conventional memory disorders and did not return to the site. In 2004, a family from Iowa, Robert and Susan Carver, traveling with their teenage daughter, stopped at the Top of the World store during a cross-country road trip. They spent 10 minutes inside the store and another 15 walking around the parking area before continuing their drive. An hour later, Susan Carver realized she could not remember her daughter's name. She panicked, thinking she was having a stroke. Her husband pulled over and they called emergency services. By the time paramedics arrived, nearly 40 minutes later, Susan had regained the memory. Medical personnel found no signs of neurological distress. Her blood pressure and cognitive function were normal. The incident was documented in the Park County Emergency Response Log as a false alarm, though the paramedic who responded noted in his personal records that Susan had been genuinely unable to recall a name she had known for 16 years. The Carvers did not connect the experience to the rest stop until months later, when Susan read an online forum discussing the phenomenon. She posted her account, which prompted several others to share similar stories. The forum thread eventually accumulated over 60 reports spanning 2 decades, all describing the same pattern. In 2009, a graduate student in cognitive science named Aaron Goldstein compiled the forum reports and attempted to identify common variables. He found that the effect occurred most frequently between the hours of 5 a.m. and 8 a.m., with a secondary peak around dusk. It affected roughly 1 in 4 visitors, with no apparent correlation to age, gender, or health status. The duration of the memory loss ranged from 18 minutes to 11 hours, with a median of approximately 2 hours. Goldstein contacted the Montana Department of Health and Human Services to inquire whether similar effects had been reported at other high-altitude locations. He was told that no such reports existed in their database. He also contacted the Forest Service to ask whether environmental assessments had been conducted at the site. The Forest Service confirmed that routine air and water quality tests had been performed, but that no neurological effects had been investigated. Goldstein submitted a research proposal to study the phenomenon systematically. The proposal was declined by his university's ethics board, which stated that the study would require medical oversight and that the risk to participants could not be adequately assessed based on available data. Goldstein completed his degree and moved into private sector work. He has not published on the subject. The Top of the World store continues to operate each summer. Thousands of travelers stop there annually. Most experience nothing unusual, but some, roughly 1 in 4, based on informal counts, drive away and discover minutes or hours later that they have temporarily lost access to names they have known for years. The effect is consistent. It is selective. It is geographically bound, and no institution has studied it. In 2018, a retired physician named Margaret Hollister stopped at the site with her granddaughter. 20 minutes after leaving, Hollister could not recall the girl's name. The memory returned after 3 hours. Hollister later wrote to the National Institutes of Health describing the experience and requesting information about similar cases. She received a form letter thanking her for her inquiry and directing her to resources on altitude sickness. The phenomenon has been mentioned in local guidebooks, usually as a curiosity or a piece of regional folklore, but the accounts are real. The pattern is documented, and the effect continues. People stop at the Top of the World store, they leave, and for a brief window of time, the names of those they love become unreachable. Not gone, but displaced, as if stored somewhere just beyond the edge of thought. Nature does not draw straight lines. Long Lake sits at 9,600 feet on the Beartooth Plateau, a high-altitude expanse of glacially carved basins and alpine meadows that stretches across the Montana-Wyoming border. The plateau is characterized by its flatness, unusual for mountain terrain, and its scattering of shallow lakes formed by retreating ice during the last glacial period. Vegetation at this elevation is sparse. Low grasses, sedges, and scattered clusters of whitebark pine and Engelmann spruce that cling to microclimates where soil depth and moisture allow survival. Tree lines at high elevation are typically irregular. They follow the contours of the land, responding to variations in temperature, wind exposure, soil composition, and water availability. They advance and retreat in waves, creating ragged boundaries that shift over decades as climate conditions change. But near Long Lake, the tree line is different. Along the northern edge of the lake, the forest stops at a boundary so precise it appears to have been measured with instruments. For 1.3 miles, the tree line forms a straight edge that deviates less than 6 inches from a perfect geometric line. The boundary runs east to west, cutting across slopes, drainage channels, and exposed bedrock with no regard for topography. Beyond the line, there are no trees. Below it, the forest continues normally. The anomaly was first noted in 1952 by a Forest Service aerial survey team mapping timber resources across the Beartooth Range. The photographs showed the straight edge clearly, and the surveyor who reviewed them, a man named Gerald Whitlock, flagged it as unusual. He assumed it marked the boundary of an old logging operation or a controlled burn perimeter. But when ground crews visited the site in 1954 to verify the cause, they found no evidence of human activity. There were no stumps, no tool marks, no fire scars. The soil showed no signs of disturbance. The trees at the boundary were healthy, mature specimens showing normal growth rings dating back over 100 years. Whitlock filed a report noting the discrepancy and recommending further investigation. The report was archived without follow-up. In 1976, a forestry researcher named Dr. Alan Merrick was studying alpine tree line dynamics across the northern Rockies. He came across Whitlock's report while reviewing historical survey data and decided to visit Long Lake to examine the site himself. Merrick brought surveying equipment and took precise measurements along a half-mile section of the boundary. He found that the tree line deviated no more than 4 to 6 inches from a perfectly straight line over that distance. He also noted that the line did not align with any known geographic feature, no fault line, no change in soil type, no abrupt shift in elevation. He collected core samples from trees on both sides of the boundary and from isolated trees that grew slightly beyond it. Laboratory analysis showed that all the trees were genetically similar and that their growth rates were consistent with normal conditions for the elevation. There was no evidence of disease, insect infestation, or chemical contamination that would explain why trees did not grow beyond the line. Merrick also examined historical records and geological surveys. He found no mention of fire, logging, or land clearing in the area. The region had been largely inaccessible until the Beartooth Highway was completed in 1936, and even then, the lake was too remote and the timber too sparse to justify commercial extraction. Merrick published his findings in a forestry journal in 1978. The paper described the tree line as an unexplained geometric boundary and suggested that an unknown environmental factor might be limiting tree growth beyond the line. He recommended long-term monitoring to determine whether the boundary was stable or shifting. The paper attracted minimal attention. One reviewer suggested that the boundary might correspond to a historical property line or survey marker from the territorial era. Merrick countered that no such survey had ever been conducted in the area, and that territorial land divisions did not extend into high-altitude wilderness. In 1983, a graduate student in ecology named Patricia Nyland revisited the site as part of her thesis research on alpine vegetation patterns. She extended Merrick's survey to cover the full 1.3 miles and confirmed that the straight edge was consistent along its entire length. Nyland also conducted a soil analysis to determine whether there was a subsurface feature, bedrock, permafrost, or a mineral deposit that might be inhibiting root growth. The soil composition was uniform on both sides of the boundary. There was no physical barrier preventing trees from establishing beyond the line. She planted seedlings just beyond the boundary to test whether they would survive. Of the 20 seedlings planted, 18 died within the first year. The 2 that survived showed stunted growth and died the following winter. Control seedlings planted just inside the boundary, only a few feet away, thrived. Nyland could not explain the results. She included the findings in her thesis, but noted that the mechanism behind the boundary remained unknown. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, suggested that microclimatic factors, wind patterns, frost pockets, or soil moisture might be creating conditions inhospitable to tree survival. But he acknowledged that such factors typically create gradual transitions, not sharp boundaries. Nyland's thesis was accepted, and she graduated in 1985. She took a position with the National Park Service and did not return to the subject. In 1991, a journalist named Michael Doyle wrote a feature article on unexplained natural phenomena in the Rockies. He included a section on the Long Lake tree line based on interviews with Merrick and Nyland. The article appeared in a regional outdoor magazine and generated some interest among hikers and naturalists, but no scientific follow-up. The Forest Service was contacted by several readers asking whether the site had been further investigated. A spokesperson stated that the tree line was a naturally occurring boundary and that there were no plans for additional research. In 2003, satellite imagery of the Beartooth Plateau became publicly available through digital mapping services. Researchers examining the images noted that the Long Lake tree line was clearly visible from space and that its geometric precision was even more apparent at large scale. A geographer named Dr. Yolanda Herrera analyzed the satellite data and calculated the bearing of the tree line. It ran at approximately 89 degrees, almost due east-west, with a deviation of less than 1 degree over its entire length. Herrera cross-referenced the bearing with historical maps, survey grids, and known human activity in the region. She found no correlation. The line did not match township or range boundaries. It did not align with any known trails, roads, or structures. It did not correspond to magnetic north or true north. Herrera submitted a paper to a geography journal describing the tree line as an anomalous linear feature of unknown origin. The paper was accepted but published with a note from the editor stating that further field verification is recommended. No such verification was conducted. In 2009, a wilderness guide named Samuel Ortega led a group of hikers to Long Lake. One of the hikers, a retired engineer, noticed the tree line and commented on its unnaturally straight appearance. Ortega, who had been guiding in the area for over 20 years, mentioned that he had always found it odd but had never heard an explanation. The engineer, whose name was Thomas Riggs, returned home and contacted the United States Geological Survey to inquire about the feature. He was told that the USGS did not have specific information on the tree line, but that it was likely a natural formation. Riggs was unsatisfied with the response. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request asking for any records related to surveys, studies, or assessments of the Long Lake area. The request returned several historical survey reports and aerial photographs, but none addressed the tree line directly. In 2015, a group of forestry students from Montana State University visited the site as part of a field course. One of the students, Ashley Brennan, attempted to use ground-penetrating radar to scan the subsurface along the boundary. The equipment detected no anomalies, no buried structures, no voids, no changes in soil density. Brennan's professor reviewed the data and suggested that the tree line might be the result of a historical weather event, a severe frost or windstorm that killed trees beyond a certain point and prevented regrowth. But he admitted that such an event would typically affect the landscape more irregularly. The Long Lake tree line remains as it was when it was first photographed in 1952. The boundary has not shifted. Trees do not grow beyond it. Seedlings planted in the forbidden zone do not survive. Aerial photographs taken over 70 years show no change. And somewhere in the forests of the Beartooth Plateau, there is a line drawn with a precision that nature does not possess. A line that has no cause, no history, and no explanation. There is a stretch of road where distance refuses to be consistent. The section of Beartooth Highway between Frozen Lake and Beartooth Lake runs through terrain that appears unremarkable by alpine standards. The road was paved in 1968 as part of ongoing improvements to the original 1936 construction. It climbs gradually through a landscape of scattered boulders, low shrubs, and windswept grasses typical of the high plateau. The asphalt is standard, 2 lanes, no shoulders, painted center line. Mileposts mark the route at regular intervals, each placed according to Montana Department of Transportation specifications. Milepost 58 sits near Frozen Lake. Milepost 59 is positioned just east of Beartooth Lake. Between them, according to every vehicle that has traveled the stretch, the distance is 1.19 miles. But when measured on foot, the distance is exactly 1 mile. The discrepancy was first documented in 1984 by a highway maintenance crew conducting routine road surveys. The crew, led by a supervisor named Vincent Delgado, was tasked with verifying milepost placements to ensure they matched updated GPS coordinates. The team used a surveyor's measuring wheel, a device that clicks at precise intervals as it rolls along the ground, to measure the distance between mileposts 58 and 59. The wheel recorded 5,280 feet, 1 mile. Delgado found this confusing because the maintenance truck's odometer had shown the distance as 1.19 miles when they drove the route earlier that morning. He assumed the odometer was miscalibrated and made a note to have it checked. But when the crew drove the section again after completing the survey, the odometer reading was identical, 1.19 miles. Delgado tested the measuring wheel on a known distance, the length of a highway rest area parking lot, and confirmed it was functioning correctly. He then walked the section between the 2 mileposts himself, counting paces and using the wheel to verify. The measurement was consistent, 1 mile. He reported the discrepancy to the regional office in Billings. A traffic engineer reviewed the report and suggested that the odometer readings might be affected by the vehicle's speed or tire inflation. Delgado countered that multiple vehicles had been tested, including personal cars driven by crew members, and all showed the same 1.19 mile reading. The engineer recommended a formal resurvey. In the spring of 1985, a Montana DOT surveying team returned to the site with electronic distance measurement equipment. The team set up a theodolite at milepost 58 and measured the straight-line distance to milepost 59. The result was 5,276 feet, just under 1 mile, accounting for the slight curve in the road. They then drove the section in a calibrated survey vehicle, equipped with a precision odometer. The vehicle recorded 1.19 miles. The team leader, an engineer named Gloria Travers, was perplexed. She had the vehicle's odometer tested at a certified facility. It was accurate to within 0.01%. She also reviewed the original construction documents from the 1960s and confirmed that the mileposts had been placed 1 mile apart, as specified. Travers submitted a report describing the findings as inconsistent and unexplained. She recommended additional testing, including GPS verification and comparison with satellite measurements. The recommendation was not acted upon. In 1992, a geology professor named Dr. Raymond Casper was driving the Beartooth Highway with a handheld GPS unit, recording elevation and position data for a research project on alpine terrain. When he reviewed the data later, he noticed that the segment between Frozen Lake and Beartooth Lake showed an unusual pattern. The GPS had logged 1.19 miles of travel distance, matching his vehicle's odometer. But when he plotted the coordinates on a map, the straight-line distance between the recorded start and end points was only 5,280 feet. Casper assumed the GPS had malfunctioned. He repeated the drive 2 weeks later with a different unit. The results were identical. He contacted the Montana DOT and requested access to their survey data for the section. He was provided with copies of Travers' 1985 report. Casper noted that the discrepancy had been documented but never resolved. He decided to conduct his own test. In August of 1993, Casper walked the section with a digital GPS tracker, a pedometer, and a handheld distance measurement device. All 3 instruments agreed the distance was 1 mile. He then drove the section in his vehicle, which was equipped with both a factory odometer and an aftermarket GPS unit. Both recorded 1.19 miles. Casper published a paper in a regional geophysics journal in 1994, describing the phenomenon as an observational discrepancy dependent on the method of measurement. He suggested that the road might be situated in an area where localized gravitational or magnetic effects were influencing electronic instruments in moving vehicles. The paper attracted some attention from physicists, but no one could propose a mechanism that would explain why only vehicles moving at speeds above walking pace would be affected. In 1998, an independent testing firm hired by an insurance company conducted a survey of the Beartooth Highway to assess road conditions and mileage accuracy for accident reconstruction purposes. The firm used laser rangefinders and high-precision GPS equipment. Their report confirmed that the section between mileposts 58 and 59 measured 1 mile when surveyed statically. But when they drove the section with their instrumented vehicle, the onboard systems recorded 1.19 miles. The firm noted the discrepancy in their report but stated that it fell outside the scope of their contract. They did not investigate further. In 2003, a truck driver named Angela Morales began logging the phenomenon after noticing that her fuel efficiency calculations were consistently off when she traveled the Beartooth Highway. Morales kept detailed records of fuel consumption, distance, and time for each route she drove. On the Beartooth Highway, her numbers never matched. She realized that if she subtracted 0.19 miles from her total trip distance for each pass through the anomalous section, her fuel efficiency returned to expected levels. Morales posted about the issue on a trucking forum. Several other drivers confirmed the same experience. One noted that his electronic logging device, required by federal regulations to track driving hours and distance, consistently recorded more miles on the Beartooth Highway than the route's official length. A journalist from a Billings newspaper investigated the claims in 2005 and interviewed Morales along with Montana DOT officials. The DOT spokesperson confirmed that the discrepancy had been documented, but stated that variations in measurement equipment and road curvature could account for the difference. The journalist pressed for more detail. The spokesperson declined to comment further. In 2009, a graduate student in transportation engineering named Marcus Aldridge obtained permission to study the section as part of his thesis on road measurement accuracy. Aldridge used multiple measurement methods: walking with a surveyor's wheel, driving with GPS and odometer, and analyzing satellite imagery. The walking measurements consistently returned 1 mile. The driving measurements consistently returned 1.19 miles. Aldridge also tested whether the effect was speed-dependent. He drove the section at various speeds, from 15 miles per hour to 60 miles per hour. The recorded distance did not vary with speed. As long as the vehicle was in motion, the distance was 1.19 miles. He attempted to submit his findings to a transportation journal. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the results contradicted established principles of distance measurement and suggested that Aldridge had made an error in his methodology. Aldridge changed the focus of his thesis. He graduated in 2011 and now works for a consulting firm in Colorado. He has not returned to the subject. The Montana Department of Transportation updated its digital mapping system in 2014. The new system incorporates GPS data and satellite imagery to ensure milepost accuracy. According to the updated maps, the distance between mileposts 58 and 59 is listed as 1 mile. But vehicles traveling the section still record 1.19 miles. Online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena now list the stretch as a known anomaly. Travelers occasionally stop at the mileposts to test the effect themselves. Some walk the distance and confirm the 1 mile measurement. Others drive it and confirm the longer reading. No consensus exists on what causes the discrepancy. Theories range from instrument error to unusual magnetic fields to relativistic effects related to the road's elevation and curvature. None have been substantiated, and in the archives of the Montana Department of Transportation, there is a folder labeled Milepost 58 to 59 Measurement Discrepancy. The folder contains reports dating back to 1984. It has been marked low priority, no action required. The road is still there, the mileposts are still in place, and the distance between them remains exactly 1 mile, unless you're driving. Light does not lie, but at Beartooth Falls, shadows tell a different story. The Beartooth Falls overlook sits at 8,700 feet along Montana Highway 212, approximately 12 miles northeast of the Wyoming border. The falls themselves are modest. A 60-foot cascade that drops from the plateau edge into a narrow gorge carved by Beartooth Creek. The parking area is a simple gravel pullout with space for 6 to 8 vehicles, bordered by lodgepole pine on 3 sides and offering an unobstructed view of the falls and the valley beyond. The site appears in guidebooks as a minor scenic stop worth 10 or 15 minutes for travelers crossing the pass. The Forest Service maintains a small interpretive sign describing the geology of the waterfall and the glacial history of the surrounding terrain. There are no facilities, no ranger station, no reason for anyone to pay particular attention to the ground beneath their feet, until photographers began noticing that their equipment was giving them readings that should not have been possible. The first documented report came in the summer of 1989 from a landscape photographer named Julia Sorensen. Sorensen had stopped at the falls during a week-long trip to photograph the Beartooth Range. She was using a professional camera with a built-in light meter to determine proper exposure settings. The light meter indicated that the sun was positioned approximately 11 degrees further south than it actually was in the sky. Sorensen assumed the meter was malfunctioning. She took several readings, recalibrated the device, and checked it against a handheld incident light meter she carried as backup. Both meters showed the same discrepancy. She looked at the shadows cast by the guardrail posts along the edge of the parking area. The shadows pointed northeast. The sun was directly overhead, slightly west. The angle was wrong. Sorensen noted the observation in her field journal, but attributed it to optical illusion or fatigue. She continued her trip and thought nothing more of it until she returned home and reviewed her photographs. Every image taken at the Beartooth Falls overlook had the same problem. The light and shadow angles did not match the time of day recorded in the camera's metadata. She mentioned the issue to a colleague, a commercial photographer named Derek Vanderwall, who dismissed it as equipment error. But the following summer, Vanderwall traveled the Beartooth Highway himself and stopped at the falls. His light meter showed the same 11-degree offset. Vanderwall was methodical. He set up a plumb line, a weighted string hanging vertically, and used it to establish true vertical. He then measured the angle of shadows cast by the plumb line's support tripod. The shadows deviated 11 degrees from where they should have been based on the sun's position. He photographed the setup with time-stamped images and submitted them to a photography equipment manufacturer, asking whether there was a known issue with light meters at high altitude. The manufacturer reviewed the images and stated that the meters were functioning correctly. They could not explain the shadow angle. Vanderwall shared his findings on a photography forum in 1991. The post attracted responses from 3 other photographers who had experienced similar anomalies at the same location. All described the same 11-degree deviation. One noted that the effect persisted regardless of season. They had visited in both June and September and found the same offset. In 1993, an astronomer from Montana State University, Dr. Leonard Whitfield, read about the phenomenon and decided to investigate. Whitfield specialized in solar position calculations and was skeptical that a consistent angular deviation could exist without being explained by atmospheric refraction or instrument error. He visited the site in July of 1993 with a theodolite, a precision instrument used for measuring horizontal and vertical angles, and a solar position calculator. He arrived at noon when the sun was at its highest point in the sky for that latitude. He set up the theodolite in the parking area and measured the sun's position. The reading matched his calculated prediction within 0.2 degrees, well within expected accuracy for the instrument and the method. He then measured the angle of shadows cast by a vertical post he had placed in the ground. The shadow angle was 11.3 degrees off from where it should have been based on the sun's actual position. Whitfield repeated the measurements at 3-hour intervals throughout the afternoon. The sun's position continued to match predictions. The shadow angles continued to deviate by approximately 11 degrees. He returned in October and conducted the same tests. The deviation was 11.1 degrees. Whitfield could not reconcile the data. The sun was where it should be. The shadows were not. He submitted a report to the National Park Service in December of 1993, recommending that the site be studied by a team of physicists and geologists. The report included detailed measurements, photographs, and calculations demonstrating the anomaly. The National Park Service issued a brief memo in January of 1994 acknowledging receipt of the report and stating that the matter would be reviewed by appropriate personnel. 48 hours later, the memo was retracted. No explanation was given. Whitfield followed up with multiple phone calls and letters. He was told that the report had been forwarded to another agency, but was given no further details. He requested clarification on which agency and was told that the information was not available. In March of 1994, Whitfield was offered a position at a research facility in Alaska. The offer was unexpected. He had not applied for the position, and came with a significant salary increase and research funding. Whitfield accepted and relocated in May. He did not publish his findings on the Beartooth Falls site. When contacted years later by a journalist, he declined to discuss the matter, stating only that he had moved on to other projects. In 2001, a surveying company conducting GPS accuracy tests across Montana included the Beartooth Falls overlook as one of their control points. The surveyors set up a GPS receiver and a total station, a device that measures distance and angles with high precision to establish baseline coordinates. The GPS readings were accurate. The total station measurements were accurate. But when the surveyors used the total station to measure angles to known landmarks based on shadow positions during specific times of day, the angles were off by approximately 11 degrees. The survey team leader, a man named Patrick Vasquez, noted the discrepancy in his field report, but attributed it to possible magnetic interference from subsurface rock formations. The report recommended further investigation. No such investigation was conducted. In 2007, a physics teacher from Red Lodge named Catherine Briggs visited the site with her high school students as part of a lesson on solar geometry. Briggs had read about the shadow anomaly on an internet forum and wanted to test it with her class. The students set up simple sundials using wooden stakes and measured shadow angles at hourly intervals. Every measurement showed the 11-degree deviation. Briggs contacted the United States Geological Survey and asked whether geomagnetic surveys had been conducted at the site. She was told that no such surveys were in the public database. She asked whether she could request that one be performed. The USGS representative stated that survey requests required demonstrable public interest or scientific necessity, and that her inquiry did not meet those criteria. Briggs published a description of the class experiment in a regional science education newsletter. The article generated no response from scientific institutions. In 2012, a geologist named Dr. Yolanda Herrera was conducting field research on the Beartooth Plateau and stopped at the falls to take a break. She happened to notice that her compass was showing a slight deviation from expected magnetic north, approximately 11 degrees. Herrera was familiar with magnetic declination and knew that the area had a documented offset between magnetic and true north. But the offset she was observing was in addition to the expected declination. She walked 50 yards away from the parking area. The compass reading returned to normal. She returned to the parking area. The deviation reappeared. Herrera documented the observation and submitted it to a geology journal as part of a larger paper on magnetic anomalies in Montana. The section describing the Beartooth Falls site was removed by peer reviewers who stated that it was insufficiently supported and outside the scope of the paper's primary focus. The parking area remains open to the public. The interpretive sign remains in place. Travelers still stop to photograph the falls, and their shadows still point in the wrong direction. No official explanation has ever been provided. The National Park Service does not acknowledge the phenomenon. The Forest Service does not include it in any site assessments. Requests for information are typically met with silence or redirection to generic responses about optical illusions. But in the summer, when the sun is high and the shadows are long, anyone standing in the gravel pullout can see the truth for themselves. The light knows where it comes from. The shadows do not agree. Some work leaves records, but no trace. The Beartooth Highway is maintained by the Montana and Wyoming Departments of Transportation under a joint agreement established in 1958. The 68-mile route requires constant attention due to extreme weather, freeze-thaw cycles, and heavy seasonal traffic. Resurfacing projects are conducted every 3 to 5 years, documented in meticulous detail as required by federal highway funding regulations. Each project generates work orders, material receipts, inspector reports, and photographic evidence. The records are comprehensive. The asphalt tells a different story. Montana Highway 212 was originally paved in sections between 1936 and 1947, with the final continuous asphalt surface completed in the early 1950s. The road was designed to be rebuilt periodically, with new layers of asphalt applied over existing surfaces to maintain structural integrity and smoothness. By standard practice, each resurfacing adds between 1 and 3 inches of material, creating a layered profile that can be analyzed through core sampling, drilling cylindrical samples from the road to examine its composition and history. In 2006, a materials testing company called Summit Engineering was contracted to assess road conditions along the Beartooth Corridor as part of a long-term infrastructure study. The company was hired by a consortium of insurance providers who underwrote policies for commercial trucking routes and needed accurate data on road quality to assess risk. Summit Engineering's field supervisor, a civil engineer named Deborah Ung, oversaw the collection of core samples at 12 locations along the highway. Standard procedure called for samples to be taken at quarter-mile intervals in areas where maintenance records indicated multiple resurfacing projects had occurred. When the samples were analyzed in the lab, Ung found something unusual. According to Montana DOT records, the section near Rock Creek had been resurfaced 6 times between 1970 and 2005. Each project was documented with contractor invoices, material delivery logs, and completion certificates signed by state inspectors. The records indicated that a total of 11 inches of new asphalt had been applied over that period. The core sample showed only 7 inches of asphalt above the original base layer. Ung assumed there had been an error in the sampling location. She returned to the site and took 3 additional cores within a 100-yard radius. All showed the same profile, 7 inches of modern asphalt in 5 distinct layers, not the 11 inches in 6 layers that the records indicated. She reviewed the maintenance logs more carefully. Each of the 6 projects listed the same contractor, a company called High Country Paving, based in Billings, and each included detailed specifications for the work performed. The logs described the removal of damaged pavement, application of tack coat, and placement of new asphalt, followed by compaction and striping. But only 5 of those projects appeared in the physical road. Ung expanded the analysis to other sections of the highway. She found similar discrepancies at 4 additional locations. In total, maintenance records documented 17 resurfacing projects across the corridor since 1970. Core samples revealed evidence of only 11. Ung compiled a report and submitted it to the insurance consortium in January of 2007. The report noted the discrepancy and recommended that the Montana DOT be contacted for clarification. The consortium forwarded the report to the Montana Department of Transportation with a request for explanation. A DOT spokesperson responded 3 weeks later, stating that the discrepancy was likely the result of clerical errors in historical record keeping, and that some projects may have been recorded twice due to administrative overlap during database transitions in the 1980s and 90s. The explanation did not satisfy Ung. She pointed out that the 6 missing projects were not duplicates. They had distinct dates, separate purchase orders, and different project identification numbers. They also included signed inspection reports from state engineers who had certified that the work was completed to specification. The DOT did not respond to her follow-up inquiry. Summit Engineering was asked by the insurance consortium to conduct a more detailed investigation. Ung and a team of 3 engineers reviewed contractor payment records obtained through a public information request. They confirmed that High Country Paving had been paid for all 17 projects. The payment amounts were consistent with the volume of materials and labor described in the work orders. Ung contacted High Country Paving and requested information about the 6 projects that did not appear in the core samples. A company representative stated that their records from before 2000 were stored off-site and would take several weeks to retrieve. 6 weeks later, the representative called Ung and informed her that the records for the projects in question could not be located. The representative suggested that they may have been lost during a transition to digital record-keeping in the late 1990s. Ung asked whether any employees who had worked on those projects were still with the company. The representative said that most of the crew from that era had retired or moved on, but he would check with management. The representative did not call back. In 2008, a journalist named Marcus Fell read about the discrepancy in a trade publication and contacted Ung for an interview. Fell had previously covered infrastructure issues for a regional newspaper and was interested in government contracting irregularities. Ung provided Fell with copies of the core sample data, the maintenance, records, and the payment documents. Fell reviewed the materials and interviewed several former Montana DOT employees, including a retired maintenance supervisor named Gerald Whitlock, who had worked in the Beartooth District during the 1980s. Whitlock recalled the resurfacing projects and confirmed that he had signed off on multiple inspections. But when Fell showed him the list of projects that did not correspond to physical evidence, Whitlock paused. He said he remembered some of the projects clearly. He could describe the weather conditions, the equipment used, and the challenges the crews faced. But for others, his memory was vague. Whitlock mentioned one project in particular, scheduled for the summer of 1983. He remembered the paperwork being filed and the contractor arriving on site. But he could not recall actually seeing the work performed. He assumed he had been assigned to a different section of road that week and that another inspector had handled the final certification. Fell checked the inspection report for that project. It was signed by Whitlock. Whitlock could not explain the signature. He said it looked like his handwriting, but he had no memory of inspecting the work. Fell attempted to contact other inspectors listed on the missing projects. 2 had passed away. 1 could not be located. The 4th, a man named Vernon Casper, agreed to an interview but became evasive when asked about specific projects. Casper stated that he had signed hundreds of reports over his career and could not be expected to remember individual jobs from decades ago. Fell asked whether it was possible for reports to be signed without the work actually being completed. Casper said that would constitute fraud and that he had never been involved in anything of that nature. Fell published an article in 2009 questioning the accuracy of Montana's highway maintenance records. The article included interviews with Eng, Whitlock, and Casper, along with a summary of the core sample data. It suggested that either the records were falsified or the physical evidence had been removed or obscured in ways not detectable by standard sampling methods. The Montana Department of Transportation issued a statement describing the article as speculative and reiterating that the discrepancies were the result of clerical errors. The statement noted that highway maintenance practices had evolved significantly since the 1970s and that modern digital record-keeping had eliminated most opportunities for administrative mistakes. The statement did not address why 6 complete projects, each with contractor payments, signed inspections, and material receipts, had left no physical trace. In 2012, a civil engineering professor from the University of Wyoming, Dr. Leonard Travers, requested access to the original maintenance records for a research project on infrastructure longevity. He was told that many of the paper records from before 1990 had been digitized and that the originals were no longer available. Travers asked whether the digital records included scanned copies of the original documents. He was informed that only summary data had been entered into the digital system and that detailed project files were not retained. Travers submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for contractor payment records related to the Beartooth Highway. The request was granted, and he received a data set showing payments to High Country Paving for all 17 projects. He cross-referenced the payment dates with weather records, looking for patterns that might explain why some projects left no physical evidence. He found no correlation, projects that were documented in the asphalt and projects that were not both occurred across a range of weather conditions and seasons. Travers attempted to contact High Country Paving. The company had closed in 2010. Its assets had been sold to a larger contractor based in Denver. The new owner stated that they had not retained records from the previous company. Travers included a brief mention of the Beartooth discrepancy in a paper on highway maintenance practices published in 2014. The paper was peer-reviewed and accepted, but the section on the Beartooth Highway was edited to remove specific references to missing projects and replaced with a more general statement about challenges in reconciling historical records with physical evidence. The Beartooth Highway continues to be maintained. Resurfacing projects are conducted on schedule, the records are filed, the payments are made, and somewhere beneath the asphalt, there are layers that exist only on paper, projects completed, inspected, and certified, leaving no mark on the road they were meant to repair. There are bodies of water that remember weather that hasn't arrived yet. Beauty Lake sits at 9,100 feet in a glacial cirque on the eastern edge of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, accessible only by a 7-mile trail that climbs through subalpine forest and Krumholtz before breaking into open tundra. The lake is small, roughly 4 acres, and deep, fed by snowmelt and a series of underground springs that keep its waters cold even in August. The surrounding peaks rise another 1,000 feet, creating a natural amphitheater that shields the basin from prevailing winds. It is a place visited primarily by backpackers seeking solitude and photographers drawn by the dramatic alpine scenery. The lake's name appears on Forest Service maps, but carries no historical designation or indigenous place name in accessible records. It is simply marked, documented, and largely ignored, except by those who make the effort to reach it. Those who do sometimes notice that the water shows them something it should not. The phenomenon was first documented in 1991 by a meteorology student from the University of Montana named Brian Kowalski. Kowalski was conducting research on microclimate variations in alpine basins and had established a temporary weather station near Beauty Lake to collect atmospheric data over a 2-week period. On the morning of July 18th, Kowalski photographed the lake as part of his routine documentation. The sky was clear, visibility extended for miles. But when he reviewed the photograph later that afternoon, he noticed something unusual in the lake's reflection. The image showed clouds. Not the wispy cirrus clouds that occasionally streak the high-altitude sky, but dense cumulonimbus formations, dark towering structures typical of afternoon thunderstorms. Kowalski checked his weather instruments. The barometric pressure was stable. There was no indication of approaching weather. He assumed the photograph had been mislabeled or that he had somehow documented the lake on a different day. But his field notes were clear. July 18th, 8:45 a.m., clear conditions. At 3:30 that afternoon, clouds began forming over the peaks to the west. By 4:15, a thunderstorm had developed directly above the lake. The cloud formations matched those visible in the morning photograph. Kowalski noted the observation, but did not pursue it further at the time. He completed his data collection and returned to Missoula at the end of the month. The following summer, he returned to Beauty Lake with a time-lapse camera. He set the camera to capture images of the lake every 30 minutes for a 72-hour period. His goal was to document diurnal temperature variations reflected in surface conditions. When he reviewed the footage, he found the same pattern. The lake's surface consistently displayed cloud formations that did not match the sky above it. In some frames, the reflection showed clear skies, while actual clouds passed overhead. In others, the reflection displayed storm systems that would not arrive for hours. Kowalski synchronized the time-lapse footage with weather data from his instruments. The lag was not constant. It ranged from 6 to 18 hours, but the pattern was unmistakable. The lake was reflecting future weather. He shared his findings with his academic advisor, Dr. Patricia Delgado, who reviewed the footage and suggested that atmospheric refraction, or unusual light diffusion, might be creating the effect. Kowalski countered that refraction would distort the reflection, not temporarily displace it. Delgado recommended that Kowalski conduct additional tests to rule out equipment malfunction or observer bias. Kowalski agreed but was unable to return to the site for another year due to academic obligations. In 1994, a wilderness photographer named Samuel Kirby spent 3 days camped at Beauty Lake. Kirby specialized in landscape photography and had heard about the location from a hiking forum. He arrived during a period of unstable weather. Scattered thunderstorms were forecast for the region throughout the week. On the afternoon of his second day, Kirby set up his camera to photograph the lake during what he expected to be a passing storm. The sky was overcast and light rain had begun to fall, but when he looked through his viewfinder, the lake's reflection showed clear blue skies. Kirby assumed the wind was creating ripples that disrupted the reflection, but the water was calm. There were no ripples. The reflection was sharp and detailed, a perfect mirror of a sky that was not there. He took several photographs and noted the time, 2:20 p.m. At 6:30 that evening, the clouds cleared. The sky became the same vivid blue that the lake had reflected 4 hours earlier. Kirby mentioned the experience in a blog post about his trip. The post attracted a handful of comments, including one from Kowalski, who reached out to Kirby via email. The two compared notes and photographs. The pattern was consistent. Kowalski drafted a paper describing the phenomenon and submitted it to an atmospheric science journal in 1995. The paper detailed his observations, included time-lapse footage analysis, and proposed that an unknown mechanism, possibly related to the lake's depth, mineral content, or the surrounding topography, was causing the temporal displacement. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the phenomenon, if real, would require a revision of fundamental principles regarding light propagation and reflection, and that the evidence provided was insufficient to support such extraordinary claims. Kowalski revised the paper and submitted it to 2 additional journals. Both rejected it. In 1998, a geophysicist from Montana State University, Dr. Leonard Travers, read about the phenomenon on an online forum and decided to investigate. Travers had access to high-resolution spectroscopy equipment and thought he might be able to detect anomalies in the light reflecting off the lake's surface. He hiked to Beauty Lake in August of 1998 and set up his equipment on the eastern shore. Over the course of 2 days, he collected spectroscopic data from the lake's reflection and compared it to data collected directly from the sky. The light wavelengths matched. There was no spectral anomaly. The reflection was physically accurate. It was simply showing the wrong sky. Travers also measured the lake's temperature, pH, and mineral content. All values were within normal ranges for alpine lakes. He used sonar to map the lake's depth and found that it reached a maximum of 83 feet near the center, deeper than most glacial tarns of comparable size, but not extraordinary. Travers could find no physical explanation for the phenomenon. He wrote a brief report summarizing his findings and submitted it to his department chair. The chair reviewed it and suggested that Travers focus on more conventional research topics. Travers did not publish the report. He retired from the university in 2007 and declined to discuss the Beauty Lake observations in subsequent interviews. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker named Angela Ferris was producing a series on unexplained natural phenomena in the Rocky Mountains. She contacted Kowalski and Kirby and arranged to visit Beauty Lake with a film crew. The crew spent 4 days at the site in September of 2003. They documented the lake under various weather conditions and captured multiple instances of the temporal displacement effect. In one particularly striking sequence, the lake reflected a sunset with vivid orange and red hues, while the actual sky remained overcast and gray. 3 hours later, the clouds cleared and the sunset matched the lake's earlier reflection. Ferris included the footage in her documentary, which aired on a regional television network in 2004. The segment generated interest from viewers, several of whom reported visiting the lake and observing the same phenomenon. But no scientific institution followed up. The National Weather Service stated that they had no data on the site and that atmospheric conditions in alpine regions were complex and not fully understood. The United States Geological Survey confirmed that Beauty Lake was a natural feature, but had not been the subject of any specialized studies. In 2009, a physics professor from the University of Wyoming, Dr. Raymond Casper, attempted to secure funding to study the lake using satellite imagery and remote sensing technology. His grant application was declined. The review panel noted that the proposed research lacked a clear theoretical framework and that the phenomenon, if real, was more likely explained by observational error than by any genuine temporal anomaly. Casper did not reapply. The lake is still there. Hikers still visit. Some notice the reflections, most do not. And on clear mornings, when the air is still and the water is calm, Beauty Lake continues to show clouds that have not yet formed, storms that have not yet arrived, and skies that exist only in the hours to come. No one has explained how. No one has explained why. And in the archives of the University of Montana, there is a box labeled Kowalski Field Data, Beauty Lake Anomaly. The box contains time-lapse footage, spectroscopic readings, and weather logs spanning 3 summers. It has not been opened in over a decade. Some systems connect to places they were never designed to reach. The Beartooth Highway Emergency Callbox Network was installed in 1972 as part of a federal highway safety initiative. 7 bright orange boxes were mounted at strategic intervals along the 68-mile route, each containing a simple telephone hardwired directly to Montana Highway Patrol Dispatch in Red Lodge. The technology was analog. No switches, no relays, just copper wire running through conduit buried alongside the highway. The system was designed to be fail-safe. Lifting the handset automatically triggered a signal at dispatch, identifying which box had been activated. The caller would hear a tone, then a dispatcher's voice. Help could be summoned even if the caller said nothing at all. For over 2 decades, the system functioned as intended. Travelers used the phones to report accidents, mechanical failures, and medical emergencies. Dispatch logs from the 1970s and 80s show hundreds of successful calls with response times averaging under 30 minutes. But in the mid-1990s, something changed. The first documented anomaly occurred on June 12, 1995. A family from Iowa, Robert and Janet Holloway, traveling with their teenage son, experienced a flat tire near mile marker 43. Robert walked to the nearest call box, approximately half a mile west, and lifted the handset. Instead of a dial tone or dispatcher greeting, he heard voices. 2 people were speaking. The conversation was already in progress. One voice was male, discussing engine trouble. The other was female, asking about location details. Robert tried to interrupt, saying, "Hello, can anyone hear me?" but received no response. The voices continued their conversation as though he weren't there. After roughly 2 minutes, the call disconnected. Robert hung up, waited a moment, then lifted the handset again. This time, he reached dispatch normally and requested assistance. When Montana Highway Patrol reviewed the incident, they found no explanation. The dispatcher on duty confirmed receiving Robert's second call, but had no record of the first. The phone system was not designed to allow conference calls or to connect different call boxes to each other. Each box had a dedicated line running directly to the dispatch center. A technician was sent to inspect the call box. The wiring was intact. The connections were correct. There was no evidence of tampering or malfunction. The incident was logged and filed as Equipment Anomaly, Cause Unknown. 3 months later, a truck driver named Vincent Delgado used a call box near mile marker 61 to report a rock slide blocking part of the westbound lane. When he lifted the handset, he heard his own voice. The voice was describing a rock slide near mile marker 61 and asking for highway maintenance to be dispatched. Delgado stood listening to himself speak words he had not yet said, in a tone and phrasing he recognized as his own. The call lasted approximately 90 seconds before disconnecting. Delgado hung up and used his CB radio instead. He reported the experience to Montana Highway Patrol when a trooper arrived on scene 40 minutes later. The trooper noted the report but stated that the callbox system was simple technology and that Delgado had probably experienced some form of echo or feedback loop. Delgado insisted it was not an echo. He described hearing his voice speak complete sentences in response to questions from a dispatcher, questions that had not yet been asked. By 1997, Montana Highway Patrol had logged over 40 similar incidents. The reports followed consistent patterns. Callers would lift the handset and hear conversations already in progress between other travelers and dispatch, their own voices from calls they would make minutes or hours later, calls they had made earlier that day, replayed in full, conversations between two call boxes with no dispatcher present. A telecommunications engineer named Dr. Patricia Eng was contracted by the Montana Department of Transportation in 1998 to assess the system. Eng had worked on highway communication infrastructure across multiple states and was familiar with the analog call box design. She conducted a comprehensive audit of the network, testing each call box individually and tracing the copper lines from box to dispatch. She found no crossed wires, no shared circuits, and no physical pathway that would allow one call box to connect to another. The system was electrically isolated. Each phone had its own dedicated line. Creating a loop or cross-connection would require physically splicing wires together, something that would be immediately detectable during inspection. Ung documented her findings in a report submitted to Montana DOT in March of 1999. She concluded that the reported incidents cannot be explained by the existing system architecture and recommended replacing the analog network with a modern cellular-based emergency system. The recommendation was not immediately acted upon. In 2001, a wilderness guide named Samuel Ortega used a call box near Beartooth Lake to report a hiker suffering from altitude sickness. When he lifted the handset, he heard a woman's voice describing the same situation, a hiker with altitude sickness near Beartooth Lake. The voice provided details Ortega had not yet mentioned, the hiker's age, symptoms, and approximate location. Ortega listened until the call ended, then hung up and lifted the handset again. This time he reached dispatch and provided the same information he had just heard himself give. The dispatcher confirmed receiving one call from that location. There was no record of a prior call. Ortega later told a journalist that the experience had been like listening to a recording of something I was about to do. By 2002, The Montana Highway Patrol service logs showed over 200 documented circular call incidents. The term had been adopted by dispatchers to describe calls where the system appeared to be connecting to itself rather than to the dispatch center. An internal memo from 2003, obtained through a public records request, acknowledged that the phenomenon was unexplained and recurring, but noted that the system was scheduled for replacement within 2 fiscal years and that additional investigation was not cost-effective. The memo also referenced a consultation with a telecommunications specialist from a university in Colorado, though the specialist's name and report were redacted from the released document. In 2004, funding was allocated to replace the callbox system with cellular emergency towers. The 7 analog boxes were decommissioned in September of that year. A Montana DOT crew removed the phones, the mounting hardware, and the orange enclosures. The copper lines were left in place, buried beneath the highway. Between 1995 and 2004, Montana Highway Patrol logged 473 circular call incidents. The calls varied in content, but the pattern was consistent. The system was connecting to itself across time or location in ways that should not have been possible. No technical explanation was ever provided. No follow-up study was conducted. The analog system was replaced and the incident stopped. But several former dispatchers and highway patrol officers have mentioned, in off-record conversations, that the phenomenon was more disturbing than the official logs indicated. One retired dispatcher, speaking on condition of anonymity in 2012, stated that she had received calls where the traveler described events that had not yet occurred, accidents that would happen hours later, weather that had not yet arrived. She said she learned to recognize the circular calls by a specific quality in the audio, a faint static underlying the voices, like interference from a distant signal. Another former trooper mentioned that in the final year before decommissioning, some calls included conversations between call boxes that were too far apart to have any physical connection. Boxes at opposite ends of the 68-mile route, somehow linked in real-time discussions between travelers who had never met. The Montana Department of Transportation declined to comment on these accounts when contacted by researchers in 2015. The cellular emergency system installed in 2004 has functioned normally. There have been no reports of anomalous connections or temporal loops. But the copper wires are still there, running beneath the asphalt, connecting 7 empty locations where orange boxes once stood. And in the Montana Highway Patrol archives, there is a filing cabinet labeled Beartooth Callbox Incidents, 1995-2. 1004. The cabinet contains transcripts, service logs, and incident reports documenting 9 years of calls that went nowhere and everywhere at once. The cabinet has been sealed since 2006. Access requires supervisor approval. No one has requested it. There are elevations where the atmosphere forgets where it is. The summit of Beartooth Pass marks the highest point on Highway 212, cresting at 10,947 feet above sea level. The road was completed in 1936, after years of dangerous construction through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Montana. The summit sits on the Wyoming-Montana border, surrounded by alpine tundra and panoramic views that extend for over 100 miles on clear days. In 1983, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration installed an automated weather station at the summit as part of a network monitoring high-altitude atmospheric conditions across the Rocky Mountains. The station was equipped with instruments to measure temperature, wind speed, precipitation, and barometric pressure. Data was transmitted via satellite link to NOAA's Regional Climate Center in Boulder, Colorado. The equipment was standard, the installation was routine, but the data it began transmitting was not. The anomaly was first detected in June of 1984 by a meteorologist named Dr. Ellen Varga, who was reviewing automated station reports as part of her research on mountain weather patterns. Varga noticed that the Beartooth Summit Station had recorded a barometric pressure spike at 2:17 p.m. on June 9th that registered 1,013 millibars. That reading was consistent with sea level pressure. At nearly 11,000 feet, the expected pressure should have been approximately 650 millibars. Varga assumed the sensor had malfunctioned. She flagged the reading for maintenance review and continued her analysis. But when she examined the station's historical data more carefully, she found similar spikes scattered throughout the record, 14 in the previous 11 months, each lasting between 4 and 20 minutes. She contacted the NOAA technical team responsible for station maintenance. A technician reviewed the flagged data and agreed that the readings were anomalous. He scheduled a site visit to inspect and recalibrate the barometric sensor. The technician, a man named Gerald Whitlock, arrived at the summit in late July. He removed the sensor, tested it in controlled conditions, and found it functioning correctly. He installed a new sensor as a precautionary measure and returned to Boulder. The anomalies continued. Between August of 1984 and April of 1985, the station recorded 23 additional pressure spikes. Each showed barometric readings that were 50 to 400 millibars higher than physically possible for the elevation. The spikes occurred at seemingly random intervals, sometimes multiple times in 1 week, sometimes with gaps of several weeks between incidents. Varga documented the pattern and submitted a report to her supervisor recommending further investigation. Her supervisor reviewed the data and suggested that the spikes might be caused by localized pressure cells or atmospheric anomalies related to the station's exposed position on the summit. Varga countered that atmospheric pressure does not spontaneously increase by 400 millibars without corresponding changes in temperature, wind, or other meteorological indicators. The station's other instruments showed normal readings during every spike. Her supervisor did not pursue the matter further. In 1987, a high-altitude physiologist from the University of Colorado, Dr. Raymond Kosar, was conducting research on altitude sickness and noticed references to the Beartooth Summit anomalies in meteorological databases. Kosar's work involved studying how barometric pressure affects human physiology at elevation, and he was intrigued by reports of pressure readings that defied altitude. He contacted Varga and obtained copies of the station data. He also reviewed incident reports from Montana Highway Patrol and local emergency services to determine whether there had been any medical events at the summit that correlated with the pressure spikes. He found 3 cases. On September 4, 1986, a family traveling through the summit reported that their vehicle's altimeter, part of an onboard navigation system, had suddenly displayed sea-level elevation for approximately 12 minutes while they were stopped at the overlook. The family had noted the time because their teenage daughter, who suffered from a mild heart condition, had experienced unexpected dizziness that resolved once they descended below 10,000 feet. On March 22, 1987, a commercial truck driver transporting medical oxygen reported that his cargo's pressure relief valves had activated at the summit, releasing gas as though the canisters were experiencing sea-level pressure. The driver filed a complaint with his company, which investigated and found no equipment failure. On July 9, 1987, a wilderness medical technician training group conducting altitude exercises at the summit noted that their portable oxygen concentrators, devices that adjust output based on ambient pressure, had malfunctioned simultaneously. All 3 units had begun delivering oxygen at rates appropriate for sea level rather than high altitude. The malfunction lasted approximately 15 minutes, then corrected itself. COSAR requested the exact times of these incidents and cross-referenced them with the NOAA weather station data. All three events occurred during documented pressure spikes. He submitted a paper to a medical journal in 1988 describing the correlation and suggesting that an unknown atmospheric phenomenon at the Beartooth Summit was creating transient pressure inversions that could affect both instruments and human physiology. The paper included recommendations for monitoring the site more closely and for warning travelers with altitude-sensitive medical conditions. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the sample size was too small and that the pressure readings were more likely the result of sensor error than any genuine atmospheric anomaly. COSAR revised the paper and submitted it to a geophysics journal. It was rejected again. In 1992, NOAA replaced the Beartooth Summit weather station entirely. The old equipment was removed and a new, state-of-the-art automated system was installed with redundant sensors and enhanced diagnostic capabilities. The pressure anomalies continued. The new station recorded its first spike on August 3, 1992, a reading of 987 millibars at an elevation where 650 was expected. Over the next decade, the station logged an average of 18 anomalous readings per year. NOAA conducted multiple equipment inspections. Each time, the sensors were found to be functioning correctly. On 2 occasions, technicians installed secondary barometric sensors to verify the readings. Both primary and secondary sensors showed identical spikes. In 2001, a graduate student in atmospheric physics named Marcus Aldridge requested access to the Beartooth Station data for his thesis on high-altitude weather patterns. He analyzed 15 years of records and noted that the pressure spikes did not correlate with any known meteorological phenomena. They did not occur during storms. They did not align with jet stream positions. They did not correspond to temperature inversions or wind shear events. They appeared to be entirely independent of surrounding weather conditions. Aldridge proposed that the summit might be experiencing transient geophysical effects, possibly related to subsurface geological activity or unusual gravitational variations. He submitted a research proposal to study the site using gravimetric and seismic monitoring equipment. The proposal was declined. The review committee stated that the hypothesis was not supported by established geophysical principles and that funding could not be allocated for speculative research. Aldridge completed his thesis using data from other stations. He graduated in 2003 and took a position with a private weather forecasting company. He has not returned to the subject. In 2009, a journalist named Angela Ferris contacted NOAA to inquire about the Beartooth Summit Station for an article on unusual weather monitoring sites. She was told that the station was operational and that its data was publicly available. When she reviewed the data, she found that pressure spikes were still being recorded. 41 documented incidents between 2000 and 2009. Ferris requested an interview with a NOAA scientist to discuss the anomalies. Her request was forwarded to the agency's Public Affairs Office, which issued a statement describing the pressure readings as occasional sensor artifacts that do not affect the overall reliability of the station's data. Ferris pressed for more detail, noting that the artifacts had persisted across 3 separate equipment installations over 25 years. The Public Affairs Office did not respond to follow-up inquiries. In 2012, the Beartooth Summit weather station was removed from NOAA's active monitoring network. The agency stated that the decision was part of a broader effort to optimize resource allocation and that the station's data was redundant with other nearby installations. The station was decommissioned in October of 2012. The equipment was removed. No replacement was installed. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2014 seeking internal NOAA communications about the station's closure was partially granted. The released documents included budget memoranda and maintenance logs, but no discussion of the pressure anomalies. Several pages were withheld, with the agency citing deliberative process privilege. The summit is still there. Travelers still stop at the overlook. Some still experience unexplained physiological symptoms, dizziness, shortness of breath, or a sensation of pressure change that resolve once they descend. And somewhere in the archives of NOAA's Regional Climate Center, there are 28 years of data showing that for brief, irregular moments, the atmosphere at 10,947 feet behaves as though it is at sea level. No one has explained how, no one has explained why. And the station that recorded it no longer exists. Some work crews finish their jobs and vanish as though they were never there. The eastern approach to Beartooth Pass climbs through a series of tight switchbacks that gain elevation rapidly as the road transitions from valley floor to alpine plateau. The section near Cook City, Montana, a former mining town with a permanent population of fewer than 100 residents, is particularly vulnerable to rockslides and pavement degradation. The Montana Department of Transportation schedules regular maintenance along this stretch, typically during the brief summer window when the pass is fully accessible. In the summer of 1995, residents of Cook City noticed a construction crew working on the road just west of town. The crew appeared in early July and remained for approximately 2 weeks. They operated standard highway maintenance equipment, a roller compactor, an asphalt distributor truck, and several smaller vehicles. They wore orange safety vests and hard hats. They worked daylight hours, roughly 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., and were seen by dozens of locals and tourists passing through the area. No one thought much of it at the time. Road work was common. The crew kept to themselves. The work appeared professional. But when Montana DOT was contacted about the project months later, they had no record of it. The first mention of the crew appeared in the Cook City Tribune, a small weekly newspaper that covered local events and tourism news. The July 13, 1995 edition included a brief notice. Highway repair work continues on Route 212 west of town. Motorists should expect delays of up to 15 minutes during daytime hours. The July 20th edition included a follow-up. Road crew completes paving project near Coulter Pass. Montana DOT contractors have finished resurfacing work and equipment has been removed. The articles were routine. They included no byline and no direct quotes, but they provided specific details. The crew was identified as working under contract with Montana DOT. The project involved resurfacing approximately 1 mile of roadway, and the work was expected to improve drainage and reduce frost heave damage. In the spring of 1996, a Montana DOT regional supervisor named Victor Harlan was reviewing archived maintenance logs and noticed that no project had been scheduled for the Cook City area in 1995. The records showed routine inspections, but no resurfacing work. Harlan assumed there had been an administrative error, a project completed but not properly documented. He contacted the Cook City District Office to request copies of work orders and contractor invoices. The district office had no records. Harlan obtained copies of the Tribune articles and contacted the newspaper's editor, a woman named Margaret Sorensen. Sorensen confirmed that the articles had been published and stated that they were based on observations by local residents and a brief conversation she had with one of the crew members during a site visit. Harlan asked for the contractor's name. Sorensen checked her notes and provided it. Mountain States Road Services, based in Billings. Harlan searched Montana's business registries. No company by that name existed. He expanded his search to include Wyoming and Idaho. No matches. He contacted Sorensen again and asked whether she had any documentation, business cards, work orders, permit postings that might help identify the crew. Sorensen said she had not kept any records beyond her brief notes, which mentioned only the company name and the foreman's first name, Dale. Harlan filed a report with Montana DOT headquarters in Helena, describing the situation as a possible case of unlicensed contractors performing work without permits. The report recommended investigation and potential legal action. The response came 3 weeks later. Montana DOT stated that without contractor information, vehicle registrations, or material receipts, there was insufficient evidence to pursue the matter. The case was closed, but Harlan was not satisfied. He traveled to Cook City in August of 1996 and interviewed residents who had seen the crew. 7 people remembered the workers clearly. All described the same details: 8 men, standard highway equipment, professional demeanor. Several mentioned that the crew had been polite but quiet, rarely engaging in conversation with locals. One resident, a motel owner named Catherine Briggs, recalled a brief interaction with one of the workers. The man had stopped at her motel to ask about lodging rates, but ultimately decided not to stay. Briggs described him as well-spoken but old-fashioned, like he was from a different generation. She noted that he used phrases like "I reckon" and "much obliged" in ways that felt unusual for someone working a modern construction job. Another resident, a retired school teacher named Thomas Ridgway, mentioned that he had overheard 2 crew members talking near their equipment one afternoon. He said their speech had struck him as odd, not accented exactly, but formal and clipped, like they were reading from a script or speaking a language they'd learned from books. Harlan documented these accounts but could not identify the crew or the company. He submitted a follow-up report to Montana DOT. The response was the same: insufficient evidence to proceed. In 2003, a linguist from the University of Montana named Yolanda Herrera was conducting research on regional speech patterns in the Rocky Mountains. She came across Harlan's reports while reviewing archived materials related to Montana's rural communities. Herrera was intrigued by the descriptions of the crew's speech. She contacted Ridgway, who was still living in Cook City, and asked him to describe what he had heard in as much detail as possible. Ridgway recalled several phrases. "We'll have this stretch sorted directly." "No." "Need for concern, the work is sound," and "we're nearly through with the business here." He also remembered that the workers had used the word motor car instead of car or vehicle at least once. Herrera analyzed the phrasing and identified patterns consistent with American English from the 1940s and 50s, a period when certain formal constructions and vocabulary choices were more common in working-class speech. She noted that the language was not simply old-fashioned, but specifically matched the cadence and word choice documented in oral histories from that era. Herrera attempted to publish her findings in a sociolinguistics journal, but her paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the sample size was too small and that the observations were anecdotal and lacking in rigorous phonetic analysis. In 2007, a journalist named Angela Ferris was researching a feature on small-town mysteries in Montana. She learned about the Cook City construction crew and decided to investigate. She reviewed the Tribune articles, Harlan's reports, and Herrera's linguistic analysis. Ferris also discovered something Harlan had not: photographs. A tourist from California, a man named Robert Delgado, had taken several snapshots while driving through Cook City in July of 1995. One photograph, taken from a roadside pullout, showed the construction crew in the background. The image was not high resolution, but it clearly depicted workers in orange vests and a piece of heavy equipment. Ferris enhanced the photograph and examined the visible details. The equipment appeared standard for 1990s road work. The workers' clothing was unremarkable, but one detail stood out: the logo on the side of the asphalt truck. It was partially visible, obscured by distance and angle. Ferris consulted with graphic designers and equipment specialists to determine whether the logo matched any known contractor or equipment manufacturer. No match was found. The logo did not correspond to any company in Montana DOT's contractor database. It did not match any equipment manufacturer operating in the 1990s. Ferris published her article in 2008 in a regional magazine. The article included interviews with Harlan, Ridgway, and Herrera, along with reproductions of the Tribune articles and Delgado's photograph. She concluded by noting that the crew had completed professional quality work, interacted with locals, and then vanished without leaving any official trace. The article generated modest interest but no new leads. Montana DOT declined to comment. The Tribune had no additional records. The crew was never identified. In 2015, a highway maintenance supervisor conducting a routine inspection of the road near Cook City noticed something unusual. A section of pavement approximately 1 mile west of town showed significantly less wear than the surrounding road. Core samples were taken to assess the asphalt's composition and age. The lab analysis indicated that the section had been resurfaced approximately 20 years earlier, consistent with work performed in the mid-1990s. The asphalt composition matched standards used during that period. The work quality was described as excellent and consistent with professional installation, but there was no record of the project. No permits, no invoices, no contractor name. The maintenance supervisor filed a report noting the discrepancy. The report was archived. The road is still there. The pavement remains in good condition. Travelers pass through Cook City daily, many unaware that a mile of the highway they drive on was resurfaced by a crew that officially never existed. And in the archives of the Cook City Tribune, there are 2 brief articles from the summer of 1995, mentioning a company that has no history and workers who spoke like men from another time.